It all starts on Christmas Eve. Inside the crowded street, a father asks his little girl if she had a good time, and she answers all excited that it was the best day ever. Suddenly, the family bumps into a huge man. The little girl looks up, amazed, and says he is an absolute giant. That guy was our prota, who grumbles to himself about always having to shrink away just to let others pass. He keeps walking and thinks it is only natural to act like this, since he is the only completely lonely person on that crowded street. Man, that makes me sad. I am just like the prota. He then heads toward the subway entrance to avoid feeling envious of those happy families. I totally get the prota. But suddenly, he stops dead in his tracks. He locks his eyes on something that catches his attention just ahead. The young man notices someone else is all alone there. A man dressed as Santa Claus sitting on the ground. The elderly man is kneeling, hunched over against the bitter cold. Near him, there is a sign asking people to tell Santa their wish, something the young man would normally just ignore. However, tonight is Christmas Eve, the exact day he lost his parents in an accident and ended up completely alone in the world. Moved by the scene, he decides to open his wallet and pull out some cash. He hands over the bills along with a rice cake, telling the old man to take it because the food is still perfectly good. The young man leaves everything on the piece of cardboard where the old man is sheltering. Out of nowhere, Santa grabs his hands tightly and yells, deeply moved, that he is a truly kind soul. The old man keeps holding on tight and says he really wants to return the favor, begging the young man to reveal his truest wish. The prota gets startled, wondering if the old man has completely lost his mind, and instantly regrets doing something outside his daily routine. He tries to pull away, but he realizes the old man's grip is incredibly strong. Santa warns that he came to grant the wish of a kind soul, and the young man is shocked to find he cannot move at all. The old man begs, saying he cannot return to Santa's village until he hears his wish. The young man sighs and asks if he will let him go if he tells him, receiving a super positive nod from the old man. Lacking patience, the young man decides to just say his wish. He asks to win the lottery, but the old man complains, saying that wish is not sincere and demands a request straight from the bottom of his heart. The prota starts pondering what a truly sincere wish would even be. He remembers all his loneliness and how much he misses having a family that will never abandon him. So he jokes around, saying he wants a sweet wife who is gentle as a rabbit and a cute daughter like a little mongoose. Wow, that sounds awesome. I want a waifu too. Actually, maybe 3 is fine. I do not ask for much. Santa smiles and says he can smell that sincere wish from someone who has lived isolated for a very long time. He celebrates, saying he was extremely lucky to find a soul so similar to his own today. But things get weird when the old man's eyes turn glowing red, promising to find a pure wife and an exemplary daughter for him. Santa wishes him a life full of joy, while the young man tries his best to break free from that creepy situation. The young man finally breaks loose and runs away, screaming that the old man is a total lunatic who has lost his mind. The old man yells from afar, letting him know that everyone back in Santa's village is rooting for him. Shortly after, we see the subway train speeding down the tracks. Now, inside the train car, the prota looks at his wrist, which was bruised by the old man's tight grip. He wonders what on earth that crazy Santa was trying to say with all that talk, even though he thinks it is all madness. He reflects on why he made that wish for a family. Deep down, he just wanted a chance to be happy too. As he looks at a commercial poster featuring a happy family, the young man closes his eyes, wishing for a normal life, just like anyone else. Suddenly, he catches a strange scent in the air and notices the environment has become extremely cold. He wakes up a bit dizzy and groaning in pain, realizing he is shirtless. Opening his eyes fully, he goes into complete shock at what he sees. The young man realizes he is locked inside a wooden cage on a moving wagon. Oh boy, he wished for a wife and ended up a captive instead. Shivering from the cold in just his underwear, he asks himself in pure desperation where exactly he ended up. He looks to the side and sees a bearded man with a worn-out appearance sharing the cage with him. On the other side, there is another man with a tired and defeated expression. Noticing the state of the other people trapped there, he wonders if he somehow ended up in the Middle Ages. The young man is left completely speechless in the face of this bizarre new reality. Juwon holds onto the wooden bars of the cage while watching the armed guards outside, unable to understand a single word they are saying. Looking around, he notices the medieval setting, a totally unknown language, and the fact that he does not see a single other Asian person around. The young man gets extremely confused, not knowing if everything he is experiencing is just a very vivid dream or pure reality. He eventually comes to the bizarre conclusion that he somehow ended up in another world completely different from his own. The bitter cold begins to punish his body, making him shiver unstoppably as he looks down at his bare feet on the icy floor. He then spots another captive curled up in the back of the cage and wonders if the man is gone, but reminds himself that the living must carry on. Ju-hwan approaches the lifeless young man, places a hand on his shoulder, and silently apologizes for what he is about to do to survive. He takes the clothes off the deceased man and puts them on to try and protect himself from the freezing cold that was nearly finishing him off. Now a bit warmer, Ju-hwan lies down on the floor of the wagon and remembers Santa's promise to use all his power to grant his wish. He questions if this miserable situation was the happiness the old man promised, or if he had misunderstood the meaning of that word his entire life. The young man mentally begs to wake up if this is a dream, but the truth is he does not even know how many days have passed since then. Trapped without rest inside that cage on top of the wagon, the group of captives kept being hauled down an endless road in the middle of the woods. During this entire journey, Ju-hwan managed to figure out a few things, the first being that everyone inside was a captive, and the second painful discovery was the real reason the soldiers were dragging them all over the place like that. The guards' plan was simply to sell them off to anyone who was willing to pay their asking price. Suddenly, the loud sound of the cage lock opening echoes through the area, catching the attention of all the prisoners. While the soldiers line up the captives, a man who seems to be the village elder starts evaluating them, picking only those who look healthy. Although admitting he became a captive hurts his pride deeply, Ju-hwan begins to feel a tiny glimmer of hope rising in his chest. He thinks this is his only chance to escape the cage, and since he has a very good physique, he believes he will be bought and freed from there quickly. And just like that, what was his first and greatest hope since arriving in this unknown world ends up becoming the start of a brand new journey. However, all that expectation soon turns into complete despair after they visit several other villages and nobody shows any interest in him. The wagon sets off once again down the dirt road, leaving behind yet another village where the young man was completely ignored. The transport keeps moving slowly through the forest. Closely watched by one of the heavily armed knights, Ju-hwan lies down defeated and wonders how things reached such a deplorable point, questioning if it is really worth continuing to live like this. In this moment of pain, he remembers the words of his late mother, who always told him to work hard and live life to the fullest. No matter the situation, he fondly recalls her expression as she asked if he understood her advice, leaving the young Ju-hwan reflective in the past, back in the present. The young man looks up at the ceiling of the cage and calls out for his parents, doubting if he will really have the strength to endure so much suffering. The words of that strange Santa promising to grant his wish for happiness start echoing intensely inside his empty mind. Outraged, he snaps that he prefers both this world and his old one go to heck because there is absolutely nothing happy about this situation. He then spots a metal fork lying nearby and grabs it with incredible force, overcome by dark thoughts about his fate. To Ju-hwan, the only way to find true peace and escape all this unbearable pain would be to put an end to his own life. He presses the tip of the fork against his own neck, but hesitates at the very last second. As he realizes the madness he was about to commit, the young man remembers that his true dream was to have a beloved family, and that ending things in a filthy place like this was not what he really wanted. Ju-hwan lowers the object and just stands there with a completely exhausted look, not knowing what to do with his life from then on. I am feeling exactly like this right now. I am starving for your likes and comments. Suddenly, a hand appears through the gaps of the wooden cage, holding out a fresh, warm piece of bread for him. Looking up, the young man comes face to face with a beautiful brown-haired woman, smiling in an extremely sweet and welcoming way. She says a few words in that strange language he does not understand, but her intention to help him becomes crystal clear through that kind gesture. Hiding right behind the woman's dress, a very cute little blonde girl watches the young man in the cage with a lot of curiosity and shyness. Oh wow, our waifu is a single mom just the way I like it. Ju-hwan drops the fork to the floor and accepts the food, completely touched by the kindness of those two people who appeared out of nowhere. The scene then shifts to a small and cozy log cabin built in the middle of a clearing surrounded by trees. Inside the simple home, the woman and the little blonde girl are sitting together around a low wooden table for their meal. The little girl drinks the soup straight from the bowl with great enthusiasm, seeming to be starving after a long day of activities. The woman pushes another bowl full of vegetable broth toward the little one and affectionately tells her to eat a bit more. The girl stops eating for a moment and stares at her with her large golden eyes in a very thoughtful manner. The little girl complains that she is hungry, and the mother smiles sweetly, explaining that this is exactly why she is giving her more food. However, the little one fires back, saying that if she is hungry, her mother Lizzie must be just as hungry too, leaving the woman surprised. Showing an immense amount of affection, the little girl pushes the bowl of soup back to her mother so they can eat together. Lizzie gets extremely moved by her daughter's attitude and agrees that the two of them should eat together from that moment on. But the cute moment is cut short by heavy knocks on the door and a man's voice outside announcing that the village elder is here. The man mentions she does not need to open the door and says that, according to today's council meeting, one of the men brought by the soldiers will be her new husband. Lizzie goes into shock upon hearing the elder say that as soon as the decision is finalized tomorrow, she must be ready to head up the mountains with her new husband. The man adds that at dawn, she must bring food to welcome the soldiers and meet everyone at the village entrance. Alone in the dark, Lizzie panics, not knowing what to do, terrified by how fast the decision was made, and gripped by a horrible fear of being mistreated again. She shakes from head to toe in pure terror, but she knows very well there is simply no way to just run away from that awful situation. The young woman caresses the little girl's head, thinking that even though they have not been together for that long, she could never abandon this helpless child. Lizzie begins to cry in despair as she realizes she does not have the heart to leave the little girl completely alone in the world again. Seeing the sadness of her adoptive mother, the little girl's golden eyes begin to fill with heavy tears. Unable to hold back all that anguish, the little blonde girl starts crying loudly in a desperate way. The child's crying and sobs echo through the entire dark cabin while she is held tightly by Lizzie. After the crying stops, Lizzie stands up and gets lost in thought, asking herself with great anxiety what her future will look like from now on. She curls up in a corner of the room, hugging her own knees while thinking she does not want to go through that terrible nightmare ever again. The young woman then looks away with a very sad yet deeply affectionate expression for the one by her side. She watches the little girl sleeping peacefully and reflects that the situation must be just as terrifying and difficult for the child. That little girl of only 5 years old, who is the daughter of the man who recently passed away, does not even have a name to be called. Yet Lizzie recalls her sad past with bitterness, remembering when her own father sold her to a stranger for just a single rabbit pelt. She remembers that on the very first day she arrived at that cabin, even before unpacking her bags, she was mistreated by her late husband. The man attacked her violently simply because she ended up arriving a little later than the time he had demanded. For that simple reason, the abuse began, and she realized that unhappy life would be her painful new daily reality from then on. Back then, the young woman ended up passing out from so much pain on the cold wooden floor of the cabin after being mistreated without any mercy, and the little blonde girl ended up witnessing that entire horrible scene of her adoptive mother fallen and hurt on the floor of the room. Collapsed on the floor and completely bruised from the abuse she suffered, Lizzie could barely move after the terrible attack from her own husband. In that absolute hell that was that isolated cabin in the mountains, the young woman felt completely helpless and without any hope. That was when the little blonde girl, even though she was scared, crawled over slowly and sat right next to her injured adoptive mother on the floor. Lizzie realizes that the only person to show compassion and approach her with affection was that sweet child, who looked like a real angel. The abusive husband went out into the mountains that very same day and never returned, leaving Lizzie and the little girl completely alone in the cabin. Later, the villagers confirmed that the man had been attacked and taken by wolves in the forest, from where he would never return. Upon learning of her husband's passing, she felt an immense relief to be free, but at the same time, a deep anxiety began to take over her. The young woman knew very well how cruelly and poorly women without husbands were treated by the people of that medieval region. To her, a woman without a husband to protect her was seen by the other villagers as a defenseless sheep outside the protective fence. Some time later, Lizzie and the little girl are walking together down the village road while trying to move on with their lives the best way they can. Suddenly, the little blonde girl spots something unusual in the distance and points excitedly, drawing Lizzie's attention to what was happening nearby. The little girl calls out that a wagon is arriving, referring to the transport of captives brought by the guards to the village square. Lizzie watches closely as the transport vehicle approaches, having no idea who might be trapped inside that wooden cage. The mother and daughter decide to walk a bit closer to see what the soldiers were bringing that was so important to the village. However, looking inside the cage, Lizzie is left completely shocked to see the figure of Ju-hwan curled up and bound inside. The young man's gaze somehow triggers painful and terrifying memories of the awful past she tried so hard to forget. She recalls her ex-husband mistreating her cowardly and yelling that she was a useless person who could not do a single thing right. The man kept insulting her aggressively, saying she was just throwing a dramatic tantrum to get people's attention. He screamed furiously that she had completely ruined his appetite while threatening her in a terrifying way. Right in front of the little girl, Lizzie remembers perfectly the terror in her eyes as she saw her husband point that metal fork toward her face during the abuse. Staring intently at Ju-hwan, Lizzie feels a deep empathy, seeing that the young man carries the exact same expression of pain she once felt. Wishing to do something for him, the young woman reaches into the basket and grabs one of the fresh breads she had prepared to take to the square. Lizzie holds the bread gently under the watchful and curious gaze of the little blonde girl, who observes her in silence without hesitating. She begins to walk decisively toward the wagon where the captives are imprisoned. The young woman approaches the cage and extends the bread to Ju-hwan, who is kneeling on the floor of the wagon, totally surprised by that act of pure kindness. But suddenly, an elderly gentleman from the village approaches, asking if the soldiers have already arrived, startling young Lizzie a bit. The old man takes the basket from her hands and says they will welcome the soldiers, telling her to go straight back to the village, and she just nods. Lizzie calls the little one to leave the area, while Ju-hwan, still inside the wooden cage, begins to eat the bread he got from her. The little blonde girl follows her adoptive mother in silence, but still carries a very thoughtful expression about everything she saw. Alone in the cage once more, Ju-hwan holds the food tightly with both hands, feeling a bit more comforted by the young woman's gesture. The young man takes a bite of the piece of bread, but the peaceful moment is broken by the loud noise of the cage chains being unlocked. Two heavily armed soldiers open the cage door and yell extremely aggressively for Ju-hwan to get out of there immediately. Showing zero patience, the guards drag the young man out of the wagon without the slightest care, making him fall heavily to the ground, falling face first into the dirt. Ju-hwan groans in pain and tries to get up slowly under the rigid and threatening gaze of the armed knights. The guards order Ju-hwan and the other two prisoners to stay kneeling in a line on the grass to begin a bizarre ritual. One of the guards draws a sharp dagger and makes a cut on the hand of one of the captives, making the man scream in pain as blood trickles down. The soldier then begins to drip the injured man's blood directly onto some papers with mysterious writings that were on the ground. Suddenly, the sheets of paper begin to glow with an intense bluish light, making the young man wonder in shock if that is some kind of magic. He lets out a long sigh of exhaustion, completely confused and wondering what kind of bizarre world he actually ended up in right after. One of the soldiers approaches the village elder and begins to whisper something into his ear in a very low tone of voice. The elder and the soldier keep whispering and looking toward Ju-hwan, who remains kneeling on the grass without understanding anything about the situation. The young man just watches the two of them in a very confused way, exhausted from being dragged from one place to another, like he is a piece of merchandise. The next day, the sun shines brightly through the trees, illuminating the humble log cabin where Lizzie and the little girl live. A female villager hands over a large sack of supplies to Lizzie, letting her know the village will keep providing food and resources for a while. The woman warns that her new husband does not speak the local language, and that Lizzie must remember she will have to pay for all this help from the village later on. She confesses that nobody in the village liked her late husband, and that they only accepted him because they urgently needed a hunter for the patrol. The villager adds that the new husband will probably be very different, since the soldiers mentioned he seems to be just an ordinary man. Lizzie listens intently as the older lady explains that despite the young man looking rugged, his hands and feet are as delicate as a nobleman's. The lady holds Lizzie's hands and reassures her that those hands have never hurt anyone, and that she will live very well if he works hard as a hunter. With a sad and disheartened look, Lizzie replies quietly that she does not need a lavish life or lots of riches to be happy. With a trembling voice, she reveals that her only true wish is simply that her future companion is not a violent man. She tucks her daughter in gently and thinks she would already be very satisfied if he just let the two of them live in peace in their little corner of the house. Suddenly, extremely loud knocks echo on the cabin door, accompanied by the elder's voice rudely ordering her to open up right away. Startled by the sudden noise, Lizzie turns quickly toward the entrance while shielding the little blonde girl with her body. Through the wooden window of the house, one can see the imposing silhouette of Ju-hwan standing right next to the village elder. The elder opens the door in a hurry and enters the home. Announcing loudly that he has just brought the man she is going to marry, Lizzie is left completely stunned to hear talk of her new spouse, while the elder orders the guards to bring the young man inside. Upon being pushed into the cabin, Ju-hwan looks around without understanding absolutely anything, wondering where he ended up this time. Lizzie widens her eyes in complete shock as she recognizes Ju-hwan, wondering to herself why they are dragging such a worn-out man around. She watches the young man, now cleaned up and properly dressed, standing in the middle of her living room, wondering tremblingly if that man will really be her new husband. Lizzie looks at the young man from head to toe and is shocked by his imposing size, thinking she has never seen anyone so giant in her entire life. Noticing the young woman's fixed and terrified gaze, Ju-hwan also directs his eyes toward her, feeling a sudden spark of surprise in his mind. The young man realizes that the girl before him is the exact same kind person who, moments ago, had given him a piece of bread through the cage. However, he notices she is clutching her own clothes and shaking badly from terror, which makes him wonder what is causing so much fear. Meanwhile, the village elder grabs Juhuan's arm and asks in his language why he is just standing there doing nothing. The old man pulls the youth hard and orders him to get closer to Lizzie, making the young woman take a step back, scared by the sudden approach. The elder keeps gesturing and pointing at the two of them, trying to make them stand very close to each other in the middle of the room. Losing patience, the old man firmly holds Juhuan's wrist to bring his hand close to Lizzie's, who lets out a startled gasp at the touch. The elder complains that the newlyweds are way too stiff and physically places the young man's hand over hers so they finally hold hands. The old man smiles satisfied and says that, holding hands, they really look like a real couple, leaving Juhuan in complete silence. Even though he does not understand the language of these people, the prota begins to analyze the whole context of the atmosphere and realizes what is about to happen. Right then, the bizarre words of that crazy Santa about finding a wife pure as snow and a beautiful daughter begin to echo in his mind. He remembers joking around saying he wanted a bride gentle as a rabbit and looks at young Lizzie, who seems to fit that perfectly. The young man also recalls his silly wish to have a daughter cute as a mongoose. Directing his eyes to the little blonde girl right in front of him, Juhuan is left completely shocked to realize that Santa was real and actually granted his wish to have a family. Leave a like and a comment, and I will send a custom waifu your way too. However, he thinks that even if the old man wanted to grant his request, he did not need to go so far as to throw him into another world. Juhuan recalls all his recent suffering and wonders if it was impossible to receive that gift without going through so much humiliation and pain. Our prota is complaining with a full stomach here. I am out here suffering like crazy and getting absolutely nothing. The young man lowers his head with a dark expression, while an overwhelming fury begins to grow intensely inside his chest. With clenched teeth, he swears to himself that if he ever crosses paths with that Santa again, he will absolutely wreck him. While the young man emanates the furious aura of a giant bear, Lizzie and the little girl shake with fear like two little rabbits terrified by his reaction. Shortly after, Juhuan is taken by the elder and other villagers into the middle of the forest, where they begin to talk in that strange language. The young man starts getting impatient and irritated, thinking it is maddening not being able to understand a single thing they are saying there. Suddenly, the village elder turns to one of the young villagers to resolve some pending matter between them. The young villager approaches Juhuan and extends his hand, leaving the prota confused, not knowing if the guy just wants a friendly handshake. Juhuan accepts the greeting and extends his hand, shaking the guy's hand firmly, just like he normally does. However, the young villager begins to shake and break out into a cold sweat from so much pain, due to the strength of the grip, making the young man wonder if that is their standard handshake. Juhuan gets thoughtful for a moment, trying to decipher why the villager is making a face of so much suffering over nothing. Upon letting go of his hand, the youth falls to his knees on the ground, yelling in pain, while the other villagers look on shocked by the young man's absurd physical strength. The elder then approaches, bringing a wooden hunting bow and arrow in his hands, leaving the prota even more confused about what he is supposed to do. The old man offers the weapon to Juhuan, while the other youth remains on the ground, crying and holding his injured hand, which turned totally red. The elder holds the wooden bow firmly and extends the arrow directly toward the prota's chest for him to take them. Juhuan accepts the bow and thinks that, at least judging by the mood of the environment, it does not look like the old man is trying to start a physical fight with him. As soon as the young man holds the weapon, the elder begins to hop around in a bizarre way and puts his hands on his head, mimicking the ears of a little animal. The old man keeps hopping from side to side, making the funny mime, until Juhuan finally realizes he is imitating a rabbit. Looking at the bow in his hands, the prota finally understands that the elder wants him to learn how to hunt animals there in the forest. Suddenly, the elder stops, the miming startled, and puts his hands up upon seeing something moving inside the bushes nearby. The old man points excitedly and whispers for Juhuan to act fast, leaving the young man in doubt again about what exactly he should do now. Hidden among the green leaves of the low vegetation, a small and cute white rabbit chews on some leaves without noticing the danger. The elder yells desperately for him to shoot right away, but Juhuan panics, thinking that he has never held a bow and arrow in his entire life. He gets down on one knee and pulls the bowstring with difficulty, remembering that on TV they said making an arrow fly straight was already hard for beginners. With a lot of effort and focus, Juhuan tries to aim the best he can, releasing the bowstring and firing the arrow toward the bush. However, the shot passes nowhere near the target, leaving the little white rabbit totally unharmed and just startled by the sudden noise. The old man begins to laugh out loud and clap his hands excitedly, leaving the young man completely embarrassed and not understanding the reason for so much celebration over a miss. The elder keeps babbling in his incomprehensible language, while Juwan just lets out a resigned sigh, accepting his lack of aim. Sometime later, Lizzie and the little girl are walking down the forest road accompanied by another female villager, Juwan, who is already back in the clearing, hears the sound of footsteps and turns quickly to see who is approaching him. Seeing the two of them arrive, the young man feels butterflies in his stomach and gets a bit nervous around his unexpected new companion. He locks his gaze on Lizzie walking hand in hand with the little one and thinks, with his heart racing, that this girl is now officially his bride. The young man blushes slightly, seeing her come closer, feeling the beats in his chest get stronger and stronger in front of such beauty. Completely embarrassed and red-faced, the prota tries to hide his nervousness while the women and the elder gather in the clearing. A while later, they lay out a large white cloth on the grass to have a meal together outdoors for the very first time. Sitting on the cloth, Lizzie approaches in a very shy and polite manner to serve a bowl of warm soup directly to Juwan. He receives the generous bowl of broth with gratitude, which is packed with hearty chunks of meat and well-cooked vegetables. The young man begins to eat the soup with great gusto, being watched in silence and with a lot of curiosity by the two sitting in front of him. He savors every single drop with relish, leaving Lizzie quite surprised, while the little girl hides behind her mother. Finding him funny, Juwan stops for a moment and focuses his calm gaze toward his new family, feeling a cozy warmth in his chest. The young man flashes a very sweet and gentle smile, showing he has absolutely no intention of being violent or cruel to them. He reflects that the word family was always something distant his entire life, from his school days up until turning 30 years old. But now, in the face of so many hardships in this new world, destiny mysteriously decided to grant him a whole family to protect Juwan. Thinks that, although the ideal way would be to build this bond naturally, given everything he went through, the order of things does not really matter that much anymore. The young man looks up at the blue sky and thinks that even though he really wants to wreck that crazy Santa for throwing him here, he also needs to acknowledge one thing, deep down in his heart. Juwan silently thanks the old man for finally granting his greatest wish of having a beloved family by his side. The next day, things begin to move at a very fast pace as the group starts the trek toward the cabin in the mountains. Carrying a massive and heavy sack on his back, Juwan looks back and wonders if the two of them are managing to keep up with him without too much trouble. He notices that Lizzie and the little girl are already panting, sweating from exhaustion, and showing they are at the absolute limit of their physical strength. The young man feels very frustrated for not being able to even ask if they are okay, since he still does not understand a single thing of the local language. Juwan focuses his gaze ahead and sets it in his mind that he needs to adapt to this new medieval world as fast as possible to be able to help them. With that determination in mind, the young man suddenly halts his pace and stops walking in the middle of the forest path. He recalls the advice of his late mother, who used to say that when there is someone you want to protect, you must never hesitate. She always said that the moment we feel the strong desire to protect a loved one, we must act immediately without thinking twice. Juwan then turns around with a firm and decided expression, ready to take action and help the two of them carry on with the journey. The young man begins to walk back toward them, leaving Lizzie and the little girl quite confused and surprised by his approach. Seeing the giant coming closer, the little blonde girl widens her eyes and begins to whimper in fear, thinking he is going to do something bad. Juwan kneels down to their height and, with a very soft voice, asks for the little girl not to be scared. Because he is just going to hold her for a moment, Lizzie goes into complete panic, shaking with fear and clutching her own clothes while expecting the worst from a man so big and strong. Clasping her hands together, the young woman begs desperately in her language for him not to hurt them, leaving Juwan totally confused by her reaction. The little blonde girl cannot handle the tension either and starts crying. Terrified by the intimidating presence of the young man right in front of them, he realizes that even his serious expression terrifies them and regrets that they react with so much panic, just because he tried to get close. Juwan politely excuses himself and extends his arms toward the two of them, determined to solve their exhaustion problem once and for all without any effort. The young man uses his absurd physical strength to lift both Lizzie and the little girl off the ground at the same time, leaving them in complete shock. Upon being lifted so suddenly, the two let out a gasp of surprise and hold onto the prota's broad shoulders. Juwan settles Lizzie on one side and the little blonde girl on the other, holding them both with impressive ease and zero effort. The young man stands perfectly firm, carrying both the massive bag on his back and the two of them in his arms, showing his uncommon strength. The little blonde girl looks at him from over his shoulder and babbles a few words in her language, seeming a bit calmer and curious. Lizzie, on her part, stays completely paralyzed and red with embarrassment, unable to believe the ease with which he is carrying her. The young man mentally asks for the two of them to hold on real tight. While Lizzie looks at his face in a much more peaceful way, Juwan starts walking and thinks that even carrying all that heavy load, the two of them feel extremely light, almost as if they weigh nothing at all. The young man makes up his mind that he needs to quickly learn the local language and how to hunt efficiently to be able to feed his new family well. Looking at him, Lizzie flashes a very sweet and grateful smile, while Juwan thinks his life is going to be pretty hectic from here on out. Seeing the sweat dripping down the young man's face from the physical effort, the young woman gently reaches out her hand and wipes his forehead. Juwan gets a slight start from the soft and affectionate touch and stops his steps for a moment, completely thrown off. Lizzie looks away, a bit embarrassed by her own gesture. While the young man feels deeply touched by so much kindness, the group keeps moving through the forest at a much faster pace, following the elder who leads the way a little further ahead. Upon arriving in front of the old cabin, Juwan makes a polite bow and thanks the old man for showing them the whole way there. The elder returns the greeting in a simple way and turns to leave, leaving the new family alone in front of their new residence. Juwan looks at the old wooden structure and thinks that cabin will probably be even colder than his old bachelor room. He remembers with dread how he almost froze in the cage and shivers just thinking about it, reaffirming how much he hates and has always hated feeling cold. With a resigned sigh, the young man reaches out his hand to push the old wooden door and finally step into his new home. However, as soon as he opens the door and looks inside the cabin, Juwan lets out a sigh of surprise at what he sees in there. He comes across Lizzie, who had already gone inside and was waiting for him standing in the middle of the room with a face that mixes shyness and expectation. Seeing Lizzie's face bathed in tears, Juwan approaches worried and wonders, even without knowing how to speak the language, the reason why she is crying so much without saying a single word. The young woman suddenly turns around and runs out of the cabin, leaving the prota totally confused behind. The young man looks around the inside of the empty cabin and notices the place is practically stripped of any basic furniture or supplies. He walks over to the open door and observes the forest under the sunlight, feeling quite lost and worried about his bride's sudden attitude. Lizzie is curled up in the middle of the forest, crying a lot, while Juwan realizes the villagers took all the furniture and tools from the cabin. The young man thinks with anguish that the cold is only going to get worse, and without tools or weapons, he won't be able to fix the house or protect them if any wild animal shows up. Juwan walks through the forest and finally finds Lizzie curled up, saying in a very soft and calm voice that he finally found her there. Calmly, and without making any sudden movements so as not to scare her, the young man sits on the grass right next to the girl under the golden sunset light. He observes her with an extremely calm and welcoming look, trying to convey all the security she needs in that difficult moment of despair. Juwan slowly reaches out his hand and touches the top of Lizzie's head with a lot of affection, gently stroking her hair to try and soothe her troubled heart. He tells her softly not to worry, and Lizzie looks at him surprised, wondering from the kind gesture if he really is trying to comfort her. Wiping away her tears, the young woman focuses her gaze on the young man's face and thinks that he is the man she will have to share her life with from now on. She reflects that the two of them cannot communicate and that, despite living in the mountains, he doesn't even know how to hold a bow or hunt animals in the forest. Lizzie looks at him with a certain worry, wondering to herself if the two of them will really be capable of surviving together in such a hostile place. Juwan just flashes a very tender and comforting smile, showing a silent determination to take good care of his new companion and her daughter. He reassures her that he will protect her, and Lizzie, despite being full of doubts and fear about the uncertain future, feels something different begin to rise in her chest. The young man brings his hand with a lot of gentleness to Lizzie's face, caressing her damp cheek with an extremely affectionate and protective touch. One more lonely tear trickles down the young woman's shining eyes under the sunlight, filtering through the canopy of the forest trees. Juwan uses his thumb to gently wipe the tear from his bride's face, keeping a very focused and loving look directly on her. The tear falls into the water, creating tiny ripples, and Lizzie wonders with surprise why she is suddenly feeling such a huge sense of relief in her chest. Juwan remembers that in his original world, he was always alone, since the day his parents passed away. Even living in loneliness, he pushed himself and held on tight to manage to survive, no matter what Juwan thinks, that now that he finally has a family, there is absolutely no reason for him not to endure the hardships. He reassures Lizzie that he will do everything to provide for them and tells her not to worry. Lizzie starts crying even more upon hearing the sweet and gentle words of her new companion. The cute moment is interrupted when the young woman leans against his chest and her stomach growls really loudly. Suddenly, Lizzie's daughter comes running desperately toward them while screaming in her own language. The little girl gets in front of her mother and tries to push Ju-hwan away, demanding that he not hurt her. Ju-hwan is left speechless, seeing the tiny girl trying to protect her mother with so much bravery. The young man looks at Lizzie crying in his arms and realizes the weight of the responsibility he has now. Ju-hwan looks at the little girl crying next to Lizzie and feels that this entire situation of having a family is very new to him. He remembers when he saw them for the first time, not understanding who that child was and why that woman had given him bread. Ju-hwan also couldn't understand the reason why Lizzie was crying so much at that moment. However, he believes that if they keep living together and putting in the effort, they will surely become a real family. Ju-hwan hugs them both really tight and promises he will become a good husband and a good father, so he never lets them cry from sadness again. He wants to make sure neither of them ever regrets becoming a part of his life. Later, the sun begins to set behind the mountains, illuminating the humble cabin where they are going to live from now on. Once inside the house, the three of them sit on the wooden floor in a slightly awkward and distant silence. Ju-hwan thinks that despite having cried together and gotten closer in the forest, it feels like they went right back to square one. Even so, the young man is relieved that they seem just wary instead of terrified and begins to plan what he should do first. Suddenly, Ju-hwan gets an idea to break the ice and manage to communicate better with the two of them. He moves a bit closer on the wooden floor, which makes the two of them shrink back slightly in surprise. The young man points to his own chest and says his name out loud, Kim Ju-hwan, trying to introduce himself. He repeats his name slowly, thinking that even without speaking the same language, they should at least know each other's names. Lizzie observes him intently and tries to process the name the young man just pronounced in a paused way. Ju-hwan then extends his hand toward her and makes a gesture asking for her to tell him her name too. Overcoming her shyness, the young woman hesitates for a moment before whispering her own name quietly. Lizzie Ju-hwan repeats her name with joy, confirming that he finally understood what she is called. He smiles warmly and praises her, saying that Lizzie is a very beautiful name, leaving the young woman in silence. Next, he turns to the little blonde girl and asks in a gentle way what her name is. Ju-hwan notices the atmosphere got a bit strange and quiet after asking the question about the girl. He realizes that the little girl doesn't actually have a name yet, which leaves him quite surprised. Seeing the girl's sad little face, the young man begins to think of a perfect name to give her. Ju-hwan caresses the little girl's head with affection and says that from now on, he himself is going to give her a name. With a gentle smile, he chooses the name Dorothy for his new daughter. Ju-hwan explains that it's just like the girl from The Wizard of Oz, who goes on several adventures alongside great friends. He wishes from the bottom of his heart that the girl finds her own happiness and becomes a deeply loved child. The little girl tries to pronounce her own name very slowly, while the young man joyfully confirms that that name will bring her great friendships. Little Dorothy opens a massive and radiant smile, seeming to have truly loved her new name. The next day, Ju-hwan starts working hard in the forest, chopping firewood to prepare the house before the cold gets bad for good. Lizzie observes him from afar behind a tree and thinks in silence that he is a truly strange man. She reflects that even with him being much bigger and stronger than her late husband, he treats her with total gentleness instead of mistreating her to the young woman. He looks like someone completely different from all the other rude people she met throughout her difficult life. She whispers his name and thinks that although she doesn't know what language he speaks, his voice sounds very refined and gentle. Lizzie remembers her painful past and realizes she had never received affection or kindness from anyone before. The young woman wonders, with a mix of doubt and hope, the reason why that unknown man is so sweet to her. Meanwhile, Ju-hwan stops his work with the axe upon noticing that Lizzie is observing him from afar. He opens a big smile and waves happily to her, calling her name out loud. Lizzie focuses her gaze on his features, highlighting the black hair and eyes that make him so unique in that region. Far away from there, some men comment on the rumors that a nation at war managed to perform a legendary summoning of a hero. They say the legendary hero with black hair and eyes really exists, which generates quite a bit of shock throughout the region. Ju-hwan begins to walk calmly toward Lizzie under the sunlight filtering through the forest. Looking at his face up close, the young woman can't help but notice some similarities to the hero from the rumors. She thinks it would be impossible for a real hero to be there, because a warrior like that would live in a grand palace. Besides, she tries to convince herself that it's all just a silly rumor. While watching his feet getting closer, Ju-hwan stops right in front of Lizzie and lets out a gentle exclamation upon seeing her so thoughtful nearby. Observing closer, Lizzie notices that his hair and eyes are actually more brown than black. She lets out a relieved sigh upon concluding that he is just a very tall young man and not the legendary warrior. The young woman gets confused with herself for feeling so relieved. Since the two of them met just that same day, Juhwan is left totally without understanding anything. When Lizzie starts shaking her head frantically with blushed cheeks, Juhwan approaches slowly and places his hand with a lot of gentleness over Lizzie's head, surprising her. She feels her heart race and thinks to herself that she is not used to that type of affection at all. Lizzie remembers with dread that before him, men's hands only touched her head to hurt her or mistreat her. However, his touch now is extremely soft and calm, sliding with affection through her strands of hair. Feeling a very good and comforting sensation, she silently wishes that he keeps caressing her. Juhwan keeps caressing her with a serene smile, while the young woman delivers herself completely to that moment of peace. Suddenly, the young man's face also begins to blush intensely, while he observes her with deep affection. Lizzie raises her shining eyes in a gentle way, completely enchanted by his protective and loving presence. Taken by the moment under the golden afternoon light, Juhwan leans in with affection and seals his lips with Lizzie's. The young woman opens her eyes wide in surprise from the sudden kiss. Feeling her face burn from so much embarrassment, Juhwan suddenly realizes the situation and opens his eyes wide upon noticing what he just did. He gets desperate, noticing that the young woman froze from so much embarrassment with the sudden kiss. Completely red and not knowing how to apologize, the young man begins to stammer without managing to say anything. Looking for a quick excuse to get out of there, he spots an empty wooden bucket on the forest floor. Without thinking twice, he grabs the bucket in a hurry to use as a pretext to move away. He runs away as fast as he can in the opposite direction, leaving Lizzie totally confused behind. The young woman is left alone with her hand on her chest, extremely blushed and still trying to process what had happened. While he walks, Juhwan curses himself mentally and wonders what she must be thinking of him now. He regrets his own attitude, remembering that despite being married on paper, they met just today. The young man despairs even more for not managing to communicate with her, thinking if he should just pretend nothing happened. Suddenly, Juhwan stops his step in the middle of the path upon noticing something strange around him. He looks around in the dark forest and realizes he ended up moving away too much, and now is totally lost. In that moment, a terrifying sound echoes through the dense trees, leaving the atmosphere even more tense. The young man thinks about grabbing the water quickly to return home right away, but hears a strange noise right behind him. Juhwan gets paralyzed and begins to break out into a cold sweat upon realizing he is being observed very closely. Turning around slowly, he comes face to face with the gigantic silhouette of a wild creature with glowing red eyes. It is a massive wolf with sharp teeth that growls fiercely toward the prota, feeling his legs shake from dread in front of the hungry beast. Juhwan swallows hard without knowing what to do. He is shocked to confirm that it is truly a giant wild wolf right there in front of him. Without any weapon or tool to defend himself, the young man shrinks back in fear while his body shakes unstoppably. Juhwan acts on instinct, reaching his arm out quickly to grab a thick piece of wood fallen on the ground. He positions himself to face the beast, which charges in his direction, letting out an extremely fierce roar. The giant wolf bites the piece of wood with all its strength, trying to shred it to reach the young man. Juhwan lets out a cry of determination and prepares a punch with his other arm to strike the wild animal. He lands a direct punch right on the wolf's snout, making the creature stagger back from the impact. The young man curses, irritated, and keeps holding the wood firmly to prevent the beast's jaws from closing. He yells with anger, questioning if the wolf really thinks he is just going to stop living right there without a fight. With his eyes shining in determination, he reassures that he won't go down under any circumstances and prepares another attack. However, the wolf manages to snap the wood in half with a brutal bite, making the young man step back, startled. Juhwan yells in agony as a terrible pain takes over him, feeling as if his entire body were burning. Suddenly, a flame appears out of nowhere and hits the wolf, leaving Juhwan completely confused and shocked. He looks at his own hand wrapped in fire without managing to comprehend what is actually happening there. Juhwan observes, startled, his left arm in flames. While the giant wolf keeps groaning in pain, he takes advantage of the mysterious power to deliver another powerful strike against the wolf, which tries to defend itself. With all his strength, the young man lands a flaming punch straight on the fierce beast's head. He keeps delivering an implacable sequence of punches covered in fire to guarantee his survival. Finally, the giant wolf falls defeated and lifeless on the forest floor, letting out smoke due to the burns. Exhausted, Juhwan falls lying on the grass and wonders if what he just saw on his own arm was real. He examines his arm dirty with soot and gets intrigued upon noticing there is no burn mark on his clothes. The young man sits on the grass and begins to consider, totally perplexed, the possibility of having just used magic. He ponders about how falling into another world and obtaining special powers is a pretty common concept in stories. Juwon recalls the legends and fictional tales he used to read about transmigration back in his original world. He decides to test his theory to see if he really can control and summon this type of magical power. Lying on his back on the grass, he raises his right arm and yells the command to launch a fireball. He gets up and keeps yelling the command repeatedly, but absolutely nothing happens in the silent forest. Frustrated, the young man lies down again and begins to yell other famous fire spell names like Firestorm and Firewall. He tries to summon Dragon Breath and calls out to the fire spirits, but the forest remains in total silence. Despite not managing to use magic now, he notices that the previous power healed most of his injuries. The young man thinks that if he learns to control this power freely, it will be much easier to provide for his new family as a hunter. With that, he imagines he will be able to give a dignified life, with good food and a lot of happiness to Lizzie and little Dorothy. He reflects that it would also be great to be able to heal them with magic. Since in the mountain village there is no Dr. Juwon decides to analyze everything calmly, knowing that things that happen once are destined to repeat themselves. The young man remembers with sadness the passing of his grandfather, who lost his life in an accident right after welcoming him home. His relatives mistreated him and cruelly blamed him for the tragedy during the elderly man's wake. They yelled that everyone was gone because of him, leaving young Juwon devastated and fallen on the floor. At the time, he was just a middle school student and suffered with the looks of hatred from the entire family. He was treated by his own relatives as if he were a cursed plague that only brought tragedy wherever he went. Returning to reality, he decides to carry the wolf's body home before other wild animals show up. He places the massive animal on his back and resolves to leave right away. Knowing he needs to skin it as soon as possible, Juwon thinks he never imagined that seeing his late grandfather process chickens and rabbits would be so useful in his new life. Under the full moonlight, he thinks his grandfather would have loved to see him becoming a strong and capable man like this. However, the young man comes across a big doubt about how exactly he should do to train his magic. Meanwhile, inside the cabin illuminated by the fireplace, Lizzie and little Dorothy organize the few things of the home. Dorothy runs happily toward her mother, bringing an empty wooden bowl in her hands to help her. Lizzie thanks her with affection and gives a soft caress on Dorothy's head, leaving her extremely happy. The little girl closes her eyes and gives a super cute laugh, loving to receive the praise and affection from her mother. Right after, the girl begins to run and play around the cabin, drawing the attention of Lizzie, who observes her with sweetness. Curious, the little girl leans on the wooden window and peeks outside to see if Juwon is already returning. However, Dorothy lets out an exclamation of doubt upon noticing a very strange silhouette approaching in the darkness. Suddenly, the head of a massive wolf appears right in front of the window, making Dorothy scream in terror desperately. Lizzie hears her daughter's scream of terror and turns around quickly, desperate with what might have happened to Dorothy. Without hesitating, she grabs a sharp kitchen knife on the table to defend her daughter from any threat. Lizzie orders Dorothy to stay behind her, while she runs with the knife in hand toward the cabin entrance. Upon opening the door, she widens her eyes upon coming face to face with the terrible wild creature right before her. She spots Juwon exhausted, on his knees on the ground and holding the giant wolf on his back, which leaves her extremely shocked. Thinking the wolf is attacking Juwon, Lizzie screams in despair and runs to try and save him with the knife. While she screams his name desperately, Juwon finally drops the heavy, lifeless body of the wolf on the grass. The two of them approach running in panic, while the young man looks at them confused without understanding the reason for so much desperation. Lizzie stops suddenly and looks horrified at the massive wolf fallen, realizing the beast is already completely dead. Taken by a mix of relief and extreme shock, the young woman lets the kitchen knife slip from her hand and fall on the grass. Lizzie kneels next to him crying and begins to touch him to check, worried if he suffered any serious injury. Little Dorothy also approaches sobbing and grabs Juwon's leg with her little eyes full of tears. Juwon tries to soothe her, saying with affection that he just took a light bite on the arm and that he is perfectly fine. He embraces them both with all the love in the world under the moonlight, asking gently for them not to worry. Lizzie suddenly hugs him tight by the neck, crying from relief and leaving the young man totally surprised and blushed. Juwon notices she repeats the same phrase several times and deduces by the tone that she is thanking him for being safe. Dorothy also cries, holding on to him, and the young man imagines the little girl must be expressing how worried she got. He feels a bit guilty, remembering he had promised himself he would never make the two of them cry again. The next morning, the day dawns sunny in the mountains, and Juwon lets out a long sigh of exhaustion. He starts working hard early on, using a sharp knife to skin the massive wolf he took down in the forest. Juwon makes a precise cut in the wolf's hide, using the blade, focused on finishing the work as soon as possible. He wipes the sweat and reflects that the task looked much simpler to do when he watched his grandfather. The young man thinks about trying a different method next time, finding that skinning process pretty tiring. Determined to finish everything soon, Juwon goes back to slicing the red meat with dedication when he hears someone call him looking at the workshop entrance. He spots Lizzie's graceful silhouette standing right before the open door. Juwon turns around surprised and asks her name out loud to know what is happening. He walks happily in her direction, upon noticing she is holding an empty wooden bucket. Lizzie places the bucket on the ground with care and makes gestures asking for him to place the pieces of meat in there. The young man soon comprehends her simple sign language and confirms he should indeed store the meat in that bucket. He begins to think in a concentrated way, trying to remember what the word for thank you was in her language. Juwon points to himself and stammers a clumsy thank you in her language, leaving her surprised. Lizzie tries to hold back her laughter seeing his effort and ends up letting out a very cute and shy little smile. The young man gets worried, thinking if he ended up saying some nonsense or pronounced the word the wrong way. But Lizzie just smiles in a gentle way and repeats the word of gratitude with a perfect pronunciation to teach him. Juwon takes a step forward on the green grass of the forest, closing the distance that was between the two of them. He stares at her up close with a lot of affection and repeats the word with clarity, thanking her sincerely once more. The young woman gets surprised with the proximity and shyly answers back in a very soft way. Lizzie reflects she had never heard a sincere thank you in her entire life, not even from her parents or siblings. She thinks that for just bringing a bucket, she received gratitude, realizing that with Juwon, she always experiences new things. The young woman observes the young man with affection and remembers embarrassed that her first kiss was also with him that day. She feels her cheeks burn from embarrassment and gets completely flustered after remembering the kiss. Even extremely shy, the young woman follows the young man closely and can't avoid a huge curiosity regarding him. Lizzie wonders if he already kissed other women before, and if the others also felt their heart race like she does now. For some mysterious reason, her heart hurts a bit, and a strange urge to cry takes over her chest. Already inside the workshop, Juwon places the bucket on the wooden floor, and Lizzie approaches a bit apprehensive to help him. Lizzie finds unusual and strange the fact that such a big man is doing domestic work that usually women do. She wonders why he acts with so much naturalness when helping her in the kitchen, as if it were his duty since forever. However, the two of them end up bumping into each other lightly, which makes Lizzie raise her gaze quickly, surprised with the physical contact. She panics in thought, praying for him not to try to do what she is imagining in that instant. Totally blushed, the young woman closes her eyes really tightly and prepares herself, thinking she is going to receive one more kiss from the young man. Juwon leans in her direction in a gentle way and brings his face closer with a lot of delicacy. But instead of her lips, the young man gives a soft kiss right in the middle of her forehead, catching her totally by surprise. In thought, Lizzie curses herself as silly and wonders irritated why she closed her eyes in such an obvious way. Juwon just takes the bucket with the meat and remains in silence, while the young woman remains extremely flustered by his side. She despairs, imagining if she looked like a fool who was wanting to receive a romantic kiss on the lips. Suddenly, the young man turns around again in her direction, with a gentle and playful smile on his face. Determined to not cause any misunderstanding this time, the young woman resolves to keep her eyes wide open. To her absolute amazement, Juwon approaches quickly and gives her a sweet and loving kiss direct on the lips. He moves away slowly with an extremely happy and satisfied countenance, leaving the young woman paralyzed and red. While the young man walks with the bucket, he spots little Dorothy in the surroundings and calls her in a gentle way. Lizzie realizes that little Dorothy also ended up witnessing the entire moment of the kiss and gets even more flustered. With a lot of embarrassment for having been caught by the girl, Lizzie turns around quickly and runs out of the workshop. While the young woman walks hurriedly through the forest to hide, Juwon and Dorothy follow her from afar. Calmly, the young man carries the wooden bucket with the meat, while Dorothy walks happily right by his side holding hands. He looks at the little girl with a very warm smile and thanks her with affection for her help. Upon noticing the girl looked a bit confused, Juwon realizes he forgot to call her by the name he chose, Juhwan, then corrects himself and repeats the thank you, calling her Dorothy, which leaves her extremely happy. Little Dorothy opens a radiant smile of pure joy for finally hearing her beautiful name be pronounced, already inside the house. Lizzie kneels on the floor and begins to caress with a lot of admiration the soft wolf pelt they got. Sitting on the wooden floor, Juwan wonders in thought the reason why she is laying out the pelt inside the cabin. Suddenly, a light bulb goes off and the young man has a revelation about the real importance of that material for her. He comprehends that the pelt of that wild wolf is an extremely precious item of very high value for Lizzie. Dorothy also approaches and kneels next to her mother to observe the massive black pelt with curiosity. Without managing to resist the softness, the little girl lies down and begins to rub herself affectionately on the wolf's fur. Lizzie bursts out laughing with her daughter's cuteness, creating a super joyful and relaxed atmosphere inside the cabin. Juwan just observes the two of them in silence with a very serene smile, happy to see Dorothy enjoying herself so much. The day keeps running in a peaceful way in the humble log cabin that stays isolated in the middle of the forest. Lizzie begins to salt and season the fresh steaks of meat in a large wooden basin to preserve them. The young man observes her with attention to learn the conservation method and be able to do everything alone on the next opportunity. He gets glad upon noticing her happiness with the meat fat, relieved for having kept that so useful part. Juwan realizes he still has many things he needs to learn and do in this new life. He wants to understand as fast as possible how the local economy works, the trade of merchandise, and the value of things. With that, the young man decides he already rested enough and that it's time to return to work. Upon seeing him get up, Lizzie approaches quickly with a countenance of worry to stop him. Juwan gets a bit confused and asks if she wants him to keep sitting resting. He smiles and explains he is already much better, reassuring that his body doesn't hurt anymore. After the rest, Juwan tells her not to worry, promising he won't overdo the effort. She just observes in silence while the young man withdraws from the cabin in a decided way. Already in the forest, Juwan observes the size of the trees and thinks they are perfect to practice chopping firewood. He knows oak is good for firewood, but doesn't know how to identify the tree, although he trusts his own strength for the work. The young man then raises the axe with both hands and prepares to land the first strike on the tree. He holds the axe handle firmly, concentrating all his physical energy in the movement. However, right on the first impact, the axe blade detaches from the wooden handle and goes flying. Juwan gets totally embarrassed and shocked upon realizing he broke the tool right off the bat. Time passes and afternoon begins to fall over the peaceful cabin in the middle of the forest. Juwan opens the cabin door carrying a basket full of pieces of firewood on his back. Upon seeing the young man arrive, Lizzie and little Dorothy get extremely startled with the scene. Without wasting time, the young woman runs desperately in his direction to see what happened. She pulls him with so much haste that the young man ends up falling sitting on the floor, totally without understanding her reaction. Lizzie holds his hands with worry, while Juwan tries to soothe her, saying that everything is fine. Juwan thanks Lizzie for the worry shown while holding her hands with affection. Upon seeing the scene, little Dorothy turns around and runs back to the inside of the house. She goes straight to a basin full of clean water and plunges her little hands in a hurry. Next, the little girl runs quickly in their direction with her hands wet and dripping. Without anyone expecting, she throws the fresh water straight at Juwan's face, leaving the couple shocked with the attitude totally soaked. The young man lets out a confused laugh without understanding well what the girl's plan was. Lizzie can't hold herself back and bursts out laughing upon seeing her groom's confused expression. The little girl looks at them awkwardly, realizing her attempt to help ended up being funny. Juwan lowers himself with affection, gives a caress on her head, and thanks cute Dorothy for the good intention. Animated with the praise, the girl runs away again to fetch more water, forcing Juwan to yell, asking for her to stop. Upon seeing his bride smiling with so much lightness by his side, Juwan thinks that all that looks like a true dream. He remembers how he thought it was impossible to be happy like this, and decides he will do everything to keep Lizzie and Dorothy always smiling. Night falls quietly in the forest, and smoke begins to rise through the chimney of the cozy log cabin. The fire lit in the fireplace keeps the environment warm and comfortable for the small family that is inside. Juwan and Lizzie dine together at the table, while little Dorothy already fell asleep on a pillow lying on the floor nearby. The two of them stop the meal for a moment to look with affection and softness in the direction of the asleep little girl. The girl sleeps a deep and peaceful sleep, holding in a cute way onto a wooden toy spoon. The couple doesn't resist the cuteness of that scene and lets out a very quiet laugh so as not to wake the little one. Juwan then approaches with care and takes the asleep little girl in his arms with extreme delicacy. He gets up slowly to take her to the bed, while Lizzie gathers the things on the floor to help arrange the space. Juwan walks calmly toward the double bed, holding the girl with quite a bit of care. He lays her down softly over the soft mattress and covers her with a warm blanket to protect her from the cold. A lit candle illuminates weakly the environment, leaving the cabin with a welcoming and peaceful atmosphere. Lizzie stirs a clean cloth inside a pot with hot water to use it for cleaning. Juwan approaches her in silence while she wrings the warm fabric with dedication. Suddenly, the young woman holds his wrist firmly to call his attention in an affectionate way. Totally blushed, she looks deeply into the young man's eyes with a tender and full of affection. Countenance, Juwan gets surprised and a bit embarrassed, without understanding right the reason for that sudden attitude from his beloved watching from the outside. The two of them embrace warmly in the middle of the room, illuminated only by the weak candlelight. Lizzie leans her face softly on Juwan's broad chest, enjoying that intimate and full of affection. Lizzie raises her hand with the warm cloth to begin cleaning delicately the young man's neck. She thinks to herself that she shouldn't be embarrassed because taking care of him is something natural for a wife to do. With that, the young woman slides her hand underneath his shirt and begins to clean his abdomen with softness. Juwan just observes in silence her care, feeling deeply grateful and touched with the gesture. He opens a very sweet and welcoming smile to leave her more at ease during that moment. Even trying to calm down, Lizzie gets extremely red and embarrassed with such intimacy, perceiving his beloved's nervousness. Juwan holds her hand delicately to interrupt the cleaning. Lizzie gets surprised upon seeing him smile with so much affection from very close, making her heart skyrocket even more. The young man approaches her ear and whispers with softness for them to go sleep now. Holding hands, they walk together toward the bed to finally rest after such a long day. Lying side by side, they share a silent and intimate moment under the weak lantern light. Juwan leans with affection over Lizzie, staring at her with deep tenderness and admiration. She corresponds to her groom's look with shyness, feeling her heartbeat accelerated from happiness. The young woman opens a gentle and welcoming smile, showing she is ready to take the next step. Juwan then approaches, and the two share an extremely sweet, calm, and passionate kiss. He feels the immense delicacy of that moment and snuggles even more together with her in bed. In thought, the young man hopes that his new and beloved family never needs to depart before him. He silently asks Santa to never take Lizzie and Dorothy's happiness away from near him. The narrator reflects that the rich nobleman full of servants probably would never understand this simple reality. After all, in most commoners' houses, children grow up sharing the same sleeping space with their parents. Because of that, children end up discovering too early how couples spend their nights together. Lizzie remembers with dread how the thundering voice of her own father terrified her when she was little. After her father slept, she spent the entire night listening to her mother's crying sobs until dawn. That difficult childhood made the young woman live constantly surrounded by a lot of fear. She feared that suffering of her mother would end up becoming her own destiny in the future. Suddenly, the young woman wakes up in the present with the soft noise of something snapping in the cabin. She realizes it was the comforting sound of the firewood burning in the fireplace that woke her up. Lizzie gets surprised upon seeing herself lying in bed because she is sure she had fallen asleep on the floor. She notices with affection that Juwan carried her and even let her use his arm as a pillow. Lizzie looks to the side and sees little Dorothy sleeping peacefully embraced to her, feeling her heart full of peace. Lizzie smiles and feels immensely relieved upon realizing that married nights can be packed with affection and sweetness. She thinks that her entire world began to change for real since the exact day she met Juwan. In this moment, Juwan begins to move in bed and opens his eyes slowly, waking up right by her side. Still half asleep, the young man gives a yawn and pulls affectionately his bride and the little one closer to his chest. Lizzie is left completely breathless and feels that her heart is going to end up exploding with that so warm embrace. Feeling a pleasant tingling in her chest, the young woman wishes from the bottom of her heart that moment of peace lasts forever. The day dawns, and Juwan wakes up alone with Dorothy in bed, realizing Lizzie already got up to start the day. He sits up slowly in bed so as not to wake the little girl, who keeps sleeping a super peaceful sleep. The young man gives a light caress on the girl's blonde hair, smiling upon seeing her grumble quietly while she sleeps. Upon going to the kitchen, he finds Lizzie carrying a large metal bucket that looks to be quite heavy. Without hesitating, Juwan places his hand over hers and assumes the weight of the bucket to help her immediately. The young woman gets startled with the sudden help, while the young man just stares at her with a very calm countenance. With all his massive strength, he pours the water from the bucket with ease to speed up the house chores. Next, Juwan turns to her and speaks something in the native tongue of that different world. Upon hearing his words, Lizzie gets with her cheeks blushed and shows to be quite shy. The young man asked if she had slept well, calling her honey, but gets confused upon seeing her face get so red. Juwan wonders if all that sudden embarrassment was caused by the affectionate way he just called her. He smiles upon realizing that calling her honey or wife was what left the young woman so flustered right in the morning. With that, the young man asks how she prefers to be called and suggests using just the name Lizzie if she feels better. Stammering from shyness, she asks in a low voice for him to keep calling her Honey, leaving the young man glad. Juwon answers the request and calls her Honey, leaving the young woman even more blushed and awkward. She turns around quickly with her back turned to hide her face completely red from embarrassment. Juwon finds her reaction too cute and feels a huge urge to tease her a little bit more. He pokes her back lightly with his finger and asks affectionately for her to look at him. In this moment, little Dorothy wakes up, giving a very loud yawn in bed, and interrupts the couple's playful time. Still half dizzy from sleep, the little girl grumbles quietly, saying she wants to eat meat in the morning. She tries to move, but ends up rolling out of the bed and falling on the wooden floor of the cabin. Without minding the fall, the girl gets up quickly and runs happily in their direction. However, to Juwon and Lizzie's surprise, she passes straight by them running like a rocket. She spots the bucket with the fresh meat and gets with her eyes shining from pure happiness. The little one tries to go straight inside the large wooden bucket, drawing amused laughs from her parents. Dorothy yells animated asking for the meat, while Juwon finds that obsession for food funny. She ends up getting half stuck inside the bucket and begins to kick around with her little legs sticking out. Seeing that, the young man fills himself with determination and decides he will push himself to the maximum on the next hunt. Already in the forest, Juwon walks confident and thinks he wouldn't mind facing another wolf like the previous one. This time, he guarantees he brought a much more resistant and reliable axe to use as a weapon. The young man keeps advancing with firm and silent steps through the dense vegetation of the mountain. Suddenly, he stops and begins to look around. Feeling that something strange is happening nearby, Juwon gets intrigued upon noticing that the forest atmosphere got extremely heavy and dark from one hour to the next. He squeezes the axe handle with strength, feeling a suffocating sensation. Even being in the middle of an open woods, Juwon stays on high alert, wondering what type of creature or monstrous beast is going to rise in his path. Suddenly, limping and dragged steps begin to echo in his direction through the forest bushes. The young man gets intrigued and confused upon noticing. It doesn't concern a wild beast, but rather a person. A mysterious figure dressed in a dark cloak and hood advances slowly through the dark trail. When it approaches, the hood reveals the face of an elderly man with a gray beard and serious look. He passes in silence by Juwon, who observes him with suspicion and wonders who that stranger would be. Earlier in the forest, the elderly man had found traces of blood and marks of a beast on top of the rocks. He analyzed the place and concluded that the massive marks were left by a gigantic creature that acted alone. After spying on the cabin for days, he noticed Juwon was just a strong woodcutter who didn't even know how to use an axe right. He found it strange that a fellow so lacking experience in hunting had managed to defeat a beast of that size alone. He knows it would be impossible, because even experienced hunters would have extreme difficulty to do that without weapons. The elderly man then resolves to speak directly with Juwon, using the local language of that mountainous region. He decides he needs to analyze the situation close up to discover the truth behind the young man's unusual strength. Back to the present, the strange elderly man keeps passing slowly right by Juwon's side through the trail. With an astute look, the hooded man observes discreetly the young man's robust body while he walks. He suddenly notices the healed claw marks on Juwon's arm and gets extremely intrigued. He perceives that the wound was caused by wolf teeth, but gets impressed with the fact that the healing is so clean. A deep injury like that should have torn Juwon's muscles, preventing him from moving and working normally. In front of such an absurd recovery, the elderly man begins to suspect that Juwon might be a rare mage with healing powers. After all, in that medieval world, powerful mages truly exist and are capable of extraordinary feats. The elderly man remembers that mages are incredibly rare people, whom commoners almost never have the chance to see in life. He thinks that if Juwon truly is a mage, a unique opportunity just fell from the sky into his hands. The old man opens a terrifyingly dark smile upon realizing that his so expected chance finally arrived. He celebrates mentally for having the opportunity to get revenge, something he thought would never happen before dying. Juwon feels a shiver and wonders in thought who that mysterious elderly man in front of him truly is. The elderly man begins to recall the past, from when he wasn't a worn-out old man, but rather a strong youth full of energy. At that time, the forest patrollers who served in the war had the chance to become advisors to the feudal lord. Because of that, he left his father behind and traveled to a distant village to try his luck as the new local woodcutter. In a short time, he managed to get the job, taking advantage of the fact that the region's mountain was extremely rich in natural resources. The only problem was the big competition, since even commoners could enter freely to gather firewood without a way out. He decided to climb higher to explore the terrain and find better cutting areas at the top of the mountain. He just didn't imagine the true and terrifying reason why the other residents gathered wood only at the edge of the mountain. To close the official patroller contract, the law strictly demanded that the candidate had all limbs healthy. However, shortly before signing the paper, he ended up suffering a serious accident in the woods and was disqualified immediately. He could never imagine that something so horrible was lying in wait in the depths of that silent mountain. In truth, that mountainous region was the home of terrible wild goblins that attacked invaders without mercy, hidden behind a tree. The youth shook from dread upon hearing the scary growls of the creatures getting closer. These beasts used to abduct human women from the region to force them to generate offspring for the pack. Because of that, the small local village already almost had no more women living around there, all taken by the monsters. The youth ended up being captured in a violent way, while the village became known in the entire region as the Goblin Village. The old man endured a miserable life for decades, just to manage to get revenge on those cursed goblins that ruined everything he held on living among the village residents, hating everyone, focused only on the insatiable desire for revenge. He swore to himself that he would survive no matter what, until managing to burn the beast's entire lair down to the ground. Upon looking at the young man in front of him, the elderly man is absolutely sure that Juhuan possesses the necessary power to do that. He possesses a robust physique incomparable in the region, and brute strength equivalent to that of a true giant. Besides all that, Juhuan still shows an absurd and unbelievable physical regeneration capacity. The old man concludes that the youth has potential to become the strongest monster hunter he has ever seen in his life. Currently, the goblins hide at the bottom of the mountain, but soon they will invade the village again in search of more women. Because of that, the elderly man decides he is going to train Juhuan personally to transform him into an elite hunter before the attack. He plans to hide the existence of the goblins until signing the official contract, preventing this way the young man from giving up and running away. Juhuan bows respectfully before the elderly man to greet him in a polite and peaceful way. The old man notices that even bowing and smiling, the youth keeps his center of gravity pulled back without lowering his guard. He then extends his hand and says in a friendly way that from that day on, he is going to teach Juhuan everything he knows about hunting. The elderly man guarantees the young man will become an excellent hunter, leaving Juhuan surprised and a bit thoughtful. Time flies and soon the day dawns at the cabin, making Juhuan feel he just closed his eyes to sleep. He gets up quickly from the bed and looks in a hurry in the direction of the window upon hearing a noise coming from the outside. Upon seeing the mysterious elderly man approaching the house entrance, the young man decides he doesn't want to let him enter the cabin. He doesn't want strangers creating the habit of frequenting the house where only his beloved Lizzie and little Dorothy live. Because of that, Juhuan leaves the cabin quickly to close the door and intercept the elderly man right at the entrance. Upon coming across the gentleman, the young man perceives he truly carries a quite suspicious smile on his face. Juhuan thinks that smile looks a lot like the fake expression of an HR manager during meetings. Even so, the young man knows he needs to push himself to the maximum to learn everything about hunting techniques. He turns around upon hearing Lizzie calling him and guarantees with affection he will be fine and will return shortly. She gets quite blushed and shy while packing in a slightly clumsy way a little snack for him to take. Juhuan observes her in silence and can't avoid finding her extremely cute with that wife attitude. Little Dorothy stays observing her mother cook, showing to be quite curious with all that movement. Suddenly, the little girl turns around and runs away hurriedly in the direction of the log cabin door. She opens her arms in a funny way and gets in front of Juhuan, leaving the young man totally surprised. With a serious countenance, the girl points in Lizzie's direction and reminds the young man that he forgot to take the snack. Lizzie approaches quickly and places the wrap in his bag, saying shyly for him to feed himself well. Juhuan opens a very sincere and happy smile, thinking about how wonderful it is to have a family that truly cares about him. She says goodbye using the native tongue, and the young man deduces with affection that those words mean safe travels. He repeats the same phrase to practice the pronunciation, leaving his bride very glad with his progress. Juhuan promises in a gentle way he will return as fast as possible. Pulling a beautiful smile from Lizzie's face, Lizzie then calls Dorothy to say goodbye too, leaving the little girl a bit confused for an instant. But soon the girl opens a radiant smile and runs happily in the direction of the door to say bye to the young man. The young man waves back with quite a bit of enthusiasm, promising to little Dorothy that he will return shortly. Upon beginning to walk with the old man, Juhuan looks back and thinks about how difficult it is getting to feel like leaving the house. He keeps his gaze fixed in the direction of the two of them, feeling his chest tighten from so much affection for that new life. He smiles silly upon concluding that his new wife and his daughter are too cute for him to want to stay away from them. Ju-hwan follows the old man through the forest and begins to wonder how long they have already been walking. He gets curious and a bit tense, trying to guess what the elderly man wants to show him that is taking so long. Suddenly, the old hunter stops walking and says something in the native tongue of that world. Ju-hwan observes with attention and perceives the elderly man is pointing for him to look direct at his feet. The hunter restarts walking through the trail, showing a quite peculiar and rhythmic way of taking each step. Ju-hwan perceives he steps with so much strength and precision that he manages to sink his footprints in the soft dirt. The young man gets completely shocked upon noticing the technique behind that apparently simple walking. He concludes that the footprints left by the elderly man on the dirt trail are extremely unusual and enigmatic. He wonders if that is a step technique similar to the ones he read in martial arts novels back on Earth. Determined to master that ability, Ju-hwan realizes he needs to observe with a lot of attention and try to copy him. The youth begins to imitate the movements with care, raising well his feet at each step to train the technique. Upon hearing the young man trying to imitate him, the elderly man turns around suddenly to see what he is doing on the trail. The old man stares at him for an instant and opens a tender smile, seeming to approve the effort and dedication of his new student. From this moment on, the elderly man begins to teach Ju-hwan several secrets and valuable knowledge about the mountain. He makes the youth touch the tree trunks and explains that each mountain possesses totally unique plant species. The old man also teaches him to recognize the relief and the terrain of the region, making him grope the grass and the soil with his hands. After a lot of training and walking, the two of them finally stop to rest at the top of a large rock on the mountain. The elderly man stirs in his leather bag hanging on his waist, looking for something to show Ju-hwan. He withdraws with care a small, carved wooden object from inside his travel bag. Ju-hwan observes curious while the elderly man brings the mysterious object to his lips, anxious for what is going to happen next. Ju-hwan gets animated for finally being able to savor the delicious lunch that Lizzie prepared for him with so much affection. He opens the lunchbox lid with care, feeling his mouth water just imagining the flavor of the meal. The young man loves the aroma of the food, but the elderly man yells suddenly for him not to open the lunchbox in that place. Ju-hwan takes a start with the yell and looks at the old man, who points with seriousness to the woods around. The hunter explains that opening food in the middle of that dense forest is a terrible idea and gestures for him to close it. He teaches that the strong smell of prepared food spreads very fast, attracting beasts and wild animals on the spot. Ju-hwan closes the lunchbox discouraged, regretting the fact of not being able to eat the meal that Lizzie prepared with so much effort. He holds back the tears of frustration, while the elderly man observes him with a calm and unshakable countenance. Next, the two of them walk to a rustic wooden cabin that serves as shelter and base for the old hunter. The man comes out of there bringing two large hunting bows, but Ju-hwan finds their shape a bit bizarre and different. The young man gets thoughtful, because the only bows he knew back in his old world were those curved in a traditional way. He wonders in thought how anyone would manage to shoot using an equipment with such an uncommon structure. Without giving many explanations, the elderly man delivers one of the bows to Ju-hwan and asks for him to accompany him to the outside. Ju-hwan takes the weapon and follows him through the grass, still quite skeptical about the utility of that strange bow. He perceives an extraordinary physical strength would be necessary to manage to pull the string of such a large bow. However, with extreme ease, the old hunter pulls the bowstring and points the arrow in the direction of his target. Even holding the immense tension of the string, his body remains perfectly firm, without shaking even a millimeter. With a deafening sound, the arrow is fired at high speed and cuts the wind in the direction of the tree. The shot hits the trunk dead center with so much impact that it manages to crack the wood and raise splinters everywhere. Ju-hwan is left jaw-dropped and deeply impressed upon seeing the precision and the devastating power of that single shot. Ju-hwan positions himself and tries to reproduce the same movements, pointing the arrow to the tree with focus. While the young man tries to pull the heavy string of the bow, the elderly man approaches to adjust his posture with care. However, the old man gets shocked upon noticing that even under such physical tension, the young man doesn't move absolutely anything. Totally compenetrated, Ju-hwan focuses all his attention on the aim. Ignoring completely any fatigue, he reviews mentally everything he learned on that day, from the language terms to the hunt movement. The youth knows he needs to train in an incantatory way to manage to hunt in a totally independent way shortly. His greatest desire is to transform himself into a capable man to give a secure and comfortable life to his wife and daughter. Meanwhile, at the cabin, little Dorothy sings happily a cute song about the blue sky and her mother's shining hair. She rolls from one side to the other on the double bed, singing happy about Juwon's black hair and the tasty red meat. With her little belly very full, she plays saying she feels the meat she ate growing more and more inside her. Suddenly, the girl hears Lizzie's gentle and joyful laugh echoing through the room and turns around curious to look. The little girl perceives her mother has smiled much more since Juwon arrived, since before neither of the two laughed so much. Upon hearing her mother's warm laugh, Dorothy feels a comfort as pleasant as the warmth of a lit fireplace. She hopes her belly empties soon to be able to eat more of that delicious meat Juwon brought. However, a doubt rises in the girl's head about what the real relationship is between her and the young man who now lives with them. She wonders with sadness if because they are not her biological parents, they will also end up abandoning her one day in the future. She fears that since Juwon is just Lizzie's husband, he will end up deciding to take only her mother away with him. With her eyes full of tears, the little girl wonders what is going to happen to her if they decide to depart for good. Suddenly, the girl awakens from her sad thoughts and perceives with surprise that the cabin got in absolute silence. Scared upon seeing herself alone in bed, she looks around desperately, wondering where her mother went. Suddenly, Dorothy remembers voices from the past insulting her and calling her a useless girl. She recalls the mistreatment from her former father, who complained about her not being a boy and just wasting food. These painful memories fill the heart of little Dorothy with a massive sadness and melancholy. Scared, the little girl decides to run first in the direction of the kitchen to guarantee the meat is saved. She gets relieved upon seeing the meat remain secure, but still wonders where her mother would have gone. Suddenly, she hears rude shouts from men coming from the outside, asking what she thinks she is hiding. Dorothy takes a terrible start upon hearing that aggressive shouting and decides to peek with quite a bit of caution. She approaches slowly and opens a small gap of the wooden door to manage to see what is happening. Upon peeking, the girl perceives she already saw those violent men from the village prowling the region previously. She remembers these aggressors beat her late father, who later discounted all the anger mistreating her and Lizzie. Desperate, the little girl fears Lizzie will be mistreated to the point of passing away, just like what happened to her biological mother on the outside. One of the men grabs Lizzie with strength by the shoulder and accuses her unjustly of having stolen their meat. She tries to defend herself, saying her husband hunted the animal, but the man laughs with mockery and disdains that explanation. Another aggressor yells they arranged a new husband for her to survive, and now she would be paying them with theft. He decides they are going to enter the cabin to search everything, while Lizzie cries and insists her husband hunted the meat for real. Irritated with her insistence, the man yells for her to shut her mouth and pushes her brutally direct on the grass floor. Without any type of permission, the three invaders enter the humble cabin and begin to search the place with disrespect. Upon looking around, one of them comes across the massive wolf pelt laid out and gets completely shocked with the discovery. Passing his hands on the material in a greedy way, he perceives that giant pelt is worth a true fortune in the market. Taken by greed, the aggressors begin to search desperately every corner of the house in search of more riches. Hidden underneath the furniture, Dorothy shakes upon hearing one of the men ask if there was also meat around there. She gets terrified upon realizing the invaders are suspecting the meat was truly hunted by them. Suddenly, Lizzie runs desperate to the inside of the cabin to try and prevent them from taking her things. She places herself in front of the valuable wolf pelt and yells for the aggressors not to touch a hand on it. With her eyes full of tears, she yells desperately that now belongs to them. The blonde leader approaches laughing and mocks her for finally speaking something, since before she couldn't even emit a sound. He mistreats her with brutality, complaining she is only showing her teeth now because she got a husband. With the strong impact of the blow received, the young woman is thrown and falls direct on the wooden floor of the house. Groaning in pain on the floor, Lizzie tries to recover from the physical aggression, while the men keep laughing. In this moment, she widens her eyes upon realizing her daughter Dorothy is hidden right nearby there. Lizzie stays in absolute silence to avoid drawing the attention of the aggressors in the direction of her little daughter. She deflects her look quickly to the other side to pretend she didn't see the girl underneath the furniture. Dorothy perceives what her mother did and comprehends she acted that way to protect her from the danger. Crying a lot, the little girl feels guilty for being weak and only knowing how to hide while her mother suffers. The men mock her downcast expression, but one of them expresses worry in case the mountain guard discovers everything. The other answers that the guard doesn't even understand their language and guarantees everything will be fine if they keep a secret. The leader of the invaders pulls Lizzie by the arm and suggests with malice they take the girl direct to the forest. He orders his henchmen to gather all valuable belongings while he himself carries her outside. While Lizzie begs for him to stop, the man threatens her, saying he is going to burn the cabin if she tells anything to her husband. The invaders leave there laughing out of nowhere, carrying the valuable wolf pelt and happy for having gotten a beautiful prize. Dorothy comes out of her hiding place crying and perceives, desperate, that something very terrible is going to happen to Lizzie. The little one runs hurriedly through the house, taken by panic and by the fear that her mother will never manage to return. Upon arriving at the door, she looks around helpless and cries quietly, feeling completely alone in the world. Without managing to contain any longer her massive sadness, the little girl collapses into a loud and desperate crying. She yells out loud for Ju-hwan's name, begging in tears for him to appear and return home as fast as possible. Meanwhile, the three violent men keep dragging Lizzie away through the forest vegetation. In the middle of the woods, Ju-hwan walks back with the old hunter and comments that that day felt extremely long. The elderly man calls the young man's attention, who turns around confused to see what his huntmaster wants to show him. Humble, Ju-hwan makes a respectful bow and thanks from the bottom of his heart for all the teachings of that day. Suddenly, the youth hears a desperate crying coming from afar and recognizes immediately the voice of his little Dorothy. He looks in the direction of his cabin and perceives the little girl would never cry that way without a serious motive. The hunter enters a state of absolute alert and wonders, very worried if something bad happened in his home. Thinking of the worst, he begins to run at high speed through the woods, determined to protect his wife and his daughter. On the path, Ju-hwan suddenly comes across the three invaders, carrying his wolf pelt and dragging Lizzie by force. Taken by an overwhelming fury, he advances with his eyes shining from hatred and promises to finish whoever did that. One of the aggressors hears a fast noise getting closer and turns his face back, totally confused with the situation. Without giving time for any reaction, Ju-hwan lands a devastating punch direct on the red-haired man's face. The blow is so violent that the man is thrown far and collapses, knocked out on the lawn, shocking the other two accomplices. Relieved and emotional, Lizzie raises her head with tears in her eyes upon seeing that her husband finally arrived. With a deadly look, the gigantic hunter walks in the direction of the remaining aggressors, who step back, terrified from fear. The other aggressor swallows hard and steps back scared, realizing he doesn't have the slightest chance against Ju-hwan's monstrous strength. In the blink of an eye, Ju-hwan lands a devastating kick on the man's head without showing any mercy. The henchman collapses, groaning in pain on the floor, leaving the blonde leader completely paralyzed from dread upon seeing his friends fall. Desperate, the leader of the invaders tries to land a right punch in the direction of Ju-hwan's face, but the prota dodges easily and grabs the blonde man by the waist with an impressive strength. Ju-hwan raises the aggressor without any effort and lifts him very high, ignoring his groans of desperation. With all his physical potency, the hunter throws the aggressor with his back against the hard forest floor. He positions himself on top of the enemy and raises his fist to keep beating, determined to not stop the attack there. He delivers a violent punch to the blonde leader's face, thinking that bad people only stop when they are completely crushed. Taken by a dark aura, Ju-hwan decides he needs to leave an unforgettable lesson so they never again dare return. Lizzie observes everything extremely scared upon perceiving her husband's uncontrolled fury against the men. She yells for the young man's name to try and contain him, making him finally stop his fist in the air and look back. The old hunter runs desperate and yells for Ju-hwan to take care with the enemy, who tries to attack him from behind. With superhuman reflexes, Ju-hwan extends his hand and blocks the attack, grabbing the aggressor's wrist with firmness. He twists the blonde man's arm in an implacable way, making him scream in pain while disarming him easily. With a scary look and clenched teeth, the prota intensifies the grip and makes the aggressor scream even louder. The elderly man approaches quickly and begs for the young man to stop with that violence immediately. Holding his arm, the old master insists for him to calm down and not commit a madness right there. He points in the direction of the house and asks if Ju-hwan can't see how terrified little Dorothy is with all that. Upon hearing the elderly man's words, Lizzie turns around quickly and stays without reaction, thinking about her daughter's psychological state. Still crying a lot at the cabin door, little Dorothy keeps calling for her mother with a troubled heart. Ju-hwan finally calms down and looks back in the direction of the cabin. Hearing Dorothy's crying from afar, silence returns to reign in the forest while the smoke rises slowly through the chimney of their peaceful residence. Lizzie thinks her husband looked so gentle to the point of never getting irritated, but ended up discovering a scary fury in him. She confesses to herself that for an instant, Ju-hwan's aggressiveness against those men made her remember her late husband. Taken by a brief panic, the young woman feared ending up being mistreated too, exactly like what happened to those fallen invaders. However, all suspicion vanished immediately in the moment. She looked right at the bottom of Ju-hwan's calm eyes. She perceived that tired and focused look was just trying to protect her with all possible strengths. Now, Juwon looks at her worried, seeming to think his own wife ended up getting afraid of him. The hunter approaches slowly and says Lizzie's name, leaving her thoughtful about the reason why her opinion mattered so much to him. She remains a bit shy and embarrassed, trying to process all his affection and worry for her. Although she doesn't feel any more fear, she perceives her hands still shake a bit due to all the past adrenaline. Seeing the hunter's sad countenance, Lizzie silently wishes he doesn't get so upset or hurt with the situation. She knows it would be very simple to say she doesn't have fear of him, but the language barrier still prevents them from talking normally. Without being able to use words, the young woman decides to stretch her trembling arm in his direction to make a gesture of affection. Looking at him with tenderness, she pronounces Juwon's name in a gentle way to call his attention and calm him down for good. The two take a short step forward, decreasing totally the physical and emotional distance that was between them. Juwon flashes a relieved smile and holds his wife's small hands with extreme delicacy and protection. In the instant she feels the cozy warmth of those calloused hands, Lizzie has an absolute certainty in her heart. With a beautiful smile, she comprehends she will be totally secure by his side and that nobody ever again will be able to hurt her. With a light blush on her cheeks, Lizzie brings his hands close to her face in a gesture of pure gratitude. Smiling with tears in her eyes, she thanks from the bottom of her heart for the fact that he appeared to save her. Juwon gets a bit surprised and awkward with that so warm and sincere reaction from his bride. He calls her by name in an affectionate way, trying to reassure her and show that now everything truly passed. Next, the hunter pulls her for a tight and cozy embrace, whispering a sincere thank you. While he hugs her tight, Juwon wonders in thought why she feels so immensely grateful to him. He reflects that in truth, it is he who should be thanking for having such a wonderful family by his side. Suddenly, Lizzie widens her eyes upon remembering a very important detail she ended up forgetting. Back at the cabin, little Dorothy keeps whimpering and shaking from fear of having been left behind. Lizzie moves away from the embrace and calls Juwon's attention. Pointing in the direction of the house where her daughter stayed, she begins to run desperate back to the cabin, calling by Dorothy's name with quite a bit of worry. Upon running the house, Lizzie approaches her daughter and asks hurriedly if the little girl is fine. However, the mother gets paralyzed upon seeing the expression of deep sadness and suffering stamped on the girl's face. Dorothy shakes curled up and cries in a contained way, carrying a massive past trauma in her small chest. Although she asked for help, seeing the violence of Juwon's blows up close ended up awakening old fears in the girl. Images of the former domestic abuse and of faces full of painful bruises don't stop rising in her mind. She remembers that crying only brought more punishments in the past, which left her with a terrible dread of being beaten, afraid of being ignored and despised like before. The girl feels she needs to ask for apologies to her mother immediately. In tears, Dorothy asks forgiveness for having hidden and begs desperately for her mother not to abandon her. She sobs copiously and repeats to herself that everything bad that happened was by her own fault. Lizzie pulls her for a warm embrace and asks, totally shocked, what she is talking about. The mother explains with affection she just pretended not to know her to prevent those violent men from finding her. She guarantees to her daughter she has no fault of absolutely anything, making the little girl ask if that is really true. Lizzie comforts the girl saying that Daddy now is here, but Dorothy gets confused because her old father passed away gentle. The mother asks if her little daughter really still hasn't comprehended who Juwon truly is in their lives. Dorothy answers, he is just Lizzie's husband, pulling a gentle and amused laugh from her mother. Lizzie explains that by being her husband, Juwon also became Dorothy's new and true daddy. She reminds the girl she is her stepmother, and the little girl agrees in a very innocent and cute way. With her head, Lizzie concludes saying that if she is the mother, Juwon is the father, leaving Dorothy shocked and without believing the news. The little one peeks through the door and observes the hunter's imposing silhouette from the back, marveled upon calling him father. She turns around quickly to confirm one last time with her mother if that incredible man is really her new daddy. Lizzie caresses her daughter's head and explains that Juwon is different from the late father because he doesn't mistreat them but protects them. She says he fought against those aggressors precisely for being her father and for having heard the girl's plea for help. Upon comprehending the whole truth, the little girl gets up hurriedly and runs full of joy in the direction of the outside. With her eyes shining from happiness, Dorothy yells very loud for her daddy so he can hear her from afar. She thinks that man of giant body, massive hands, and colossal strength is, with all certainty, her beloved father. The little one runs animated through the grass, proud for having such a strong and incredible daddy to protect her, along with her mother. She remembers that he never mistreats her, but always embraces her with affection. During the nights of sleep at the cabin, Dorothy recalls with joy that he always smiles at her, feeds her with tasty meat, and even gave her her own name. She feels like the happiest child in the world upon perceiving how wonderful it is to have that good man as her true father. Ju-hwan turns around surprised in the direction of the cabin upon hearing the little girl call him father for the first time. The hunter widens his eyes upon seeing the image of his beloved little daughter running happily direct in his direction, with a massive smile on his face. He lowers himself and opens his arms to receive her with all the affection in the world. Dorothy jumps direct into his arms in a warm embrace, shouting from happiness for being finally secure. Although she shouts words in an unknown language to him, Ju-hwan manages to feel perfectly all the meaning of them. He lifts the girl in his arms with ease and exhibits a serene and relieved countenance, happy for having protected his family. Suddenly, the hunter feels a strange odor coming from close and wrinkles his nose, quite confused with that smell. He looks downward and perceives with good humor that little Dorothy ended up wetting her pants due to the start she took. Seeing her innocent little face, he decides to take her to change clothes quickly before she ends up catching a cold. Meanwhile, Lizzie approaches running through the grass, happy upon seeing the beautiful harmony and union that formed between the two. The three unite in a familiar and loving embrace, celebrating that the danger finally passed and that now they are fine. In the middle of the embrace, the little girl widens her eyes upon remembering her greatest priority and asks for the meat. She lets go quickly and begins to run after the food bucket. Leaving the hunter completely surprised, Lizzie shouts by the girl's name upon seeing her walk without any fear in the direction where the aggressors keep passed out. Ignoring completely the unconscious man on the floor, Dorothy passes running direct by him with absolute focus on her objective. The little one locates the bucket full of pieces of fresh meat thrown on the lawn and smiles from ear to ear upon finding it, making quite a bit of strength and a grimace. She tries to lift the massive and heavy wooden bucket with her little hands. With an absurd determination, the little girl manages to raise the bucket above her head to safeguard the food Ju-hwan and Lizzie run, desperate after her upon seeing her carrying all that weight alone. Shouting the girl's name, Dorothy makes a serious and decided expression, holding the precious food with tooth and nail against any danger. Ju-hwan is left jaw-dropped upon seeing the girl's unbelievable strength, who carries the bucket as if it weighed absolutely nothing. He thinks amused that her obsession for meat is scary, while Lizzie gives a little laugh upon seeing the scene. The hunter approaches with affection and holds the bucket edges to help his little daughter carry the food inside. Dorothy opens her arms and celebrates happily upon seeing her strong daddy is helping her with the heavy meat bucket. He perceives that winning the eternal admiration of a child is very easy when it comes just to guaranteeing her dinner. Lizzie approaches, clapping her hands in a friendly way, and asks for her daughter to take the food at once to the inside of the house. She points to the door and says, "It is also dangerous for Dorothy to stay out there with the fallen invaders on the ground." Animated, the little girl enters running the cabin, while Ju-hwan accompanies her closely to store all the hunted meat. Already at the house entrance, the prota lets out a long sigh of relief for finally having resolved all that confusion. He turns around one last time to stare at the three fallen aggressors on the lawn, who keep groaning in pain without managing to get up. Ju-hwan stares at the aggressors with a cold and scary look, leaving clear he won't tolerate any more threat from them. In this moment, the old hunter places himself in front of him, with his arm extended, interrupting his immediate advance. The elderly man shakes his head negatively and says he must not beat or take people's lives anymore, making Ju-hwan question him. The youth reflects that truly it would be a big problem if he ended up being arrested or enslaved again in that world. He looks in the direction of the cabin and convinces himself he needs to keep his head in place, because now he is not alone anymore. Even deciding not to finish them today, he memorizes well the face of each one and promises a fate worse than death if they return. The master gives a friendly pat on the young man's shoulder and points in the direction of the cabin, indicating he must return to his family. The elderly man decides to gather the tools fallen on the floor, explaining that those items are essential to survive in the mountains. Ju-hwan enters the residence and smiles upon seeing Lizzie embracing and comforting little Dorothy, who finally calmed down. Carrying the toolbox and the valuable wolf pelt on his shoulders, the prota exhibits a happy and satisfied countenance. He places the box on the wooden floor and begins to examine the items brought by the invaders. With quite a bit of curiosity, Ju-hwan takes a hammer and thinks to himself that losing a family, a single time in life, was already more than enough for him. A sweet and determined smile rises on his face upon looking at the two people he now considers his safe harbor. He approaches his wife and his adoptive little daughter, promising mentally he will defend them from any danger. The youth caresses with care Lizzie's bruised cheek and regrets in thought not knowing how to use magic to heal her right away. Lizzie smiles sweetly and holds his cheeks, saying that everything is fine and that he doesn't need to stay so worried like that. She pulls her husband's cheeks to force a smile on him, laughing in a relaxed way at the funny expression he makes. With all his strength and delicacy, the gigantic hunter takes Lizzie by surprise in his arms, lifting her from the cold floor of the house. He comments affectionately that the floor is too cold for her to stay barefoot, leaving the young bride blushed and quite awkward. However, Ju-hwan suddenly widens his eyes and gets totally shocked upon noticing an unbelievable detail on her face. Looking very close up, he perceives with massive shock that the purple bruise on Lizzie's cheek vanished completely. The prota gets thoughtful and wonders if the mysterious magical training he performed earlier truly gave some result. With a vibrant smile and full of pride, he celebrates silently for finally having learned to use healing magic. Lizzie stares at him in a confused way, without understanding why he suddenly began to smile in such an excited way out of nowhere in the nearby village. The village chief walks thoughtful and irritated, cursing mentally a certain individual lacking sense. The man complains that this meddlesome fellow doesn't respect anyone's orders and lives putting his nose where he is not called. He talks with an irritated older lady and asks why she gets so bothered about giving a piece of fabric to the mountain guard. The chief explains they need the hunter, but the woman complains bravely. She kept that valuable fabric for 10 long years. The man agrees, but explains he had no choice, revealing that Ju-hwan looked to be someone very used to battles. Calling her foolish for not seeing the general plan, the village chief reminds she witnessed something extraordinary in the forest the day before. He recalls that Ju-hwan had serious wounds from a beast bite that healed at an absurdly fast speed right before him. The village leader convinces himself the rumors are real and that the new hunter is actually a powerful mage with healing gifts. He places his hand on his chin and reflects he needs to act with caution because even the high nobility would covet a mage with such power. The elderly man imagines that if the royalty gets interested in the young man, he himself will be able to win a true fortune selling the information. With a greedy and scheming smile on his face, he plans to reach a life of luxury far beyond being just the village chief. He walks through the village satisfied, knowing the local residents are too ignorant to notice Ju-hwan's special powers. However, he fears other guilds or nobles discover the secret and take the hunter away before he manages to profit from that. He decides the only reliable person is Gus, who must watch the young man while he seeks a noble interested in hiring the mage. The man orders the lady to try and make friends with Lizzie, commenting that the hunter learned to hunt fast and is quite smart. He alerts that the youth is on another level, and that if they don't take care, he can discover their merchandise diversion scheme. The chief adds he learned the young man loves his wife very much, suggesting the friendship can help them get cheap pelts. The woman agrees reluctant and turns her back, grumbling that indeed there exist some tasks that women need to do together. The village leader concludes thoughtful. It would be good manners to return some of the things his men stole from the hunter's cabin. He lowers himself to pick a twig on the floor and recognizes that Ju-hwan is too dangerous to be treated like the old residents from there. Next, the elderly man throws the piece of wood direct into the lit stone oven, observing the flames rise with intensity. He murmurs to himself, it's a pity to have to open hand of some riches now, but that is a necessary sacrifice. With a sinister smile in front of the fire, he reflects that sometimes it is necessary to lose a bit of meat to manage to keep the bones. Some days pass peacefully in the forest, and a sweet melody of joyful singing can be heard coming from inside their cabin. Wearing a clean shirt, Ju-hwan listens to the singing and thinks glad that his wife seems to be very happy and animated on that day. In the living room, Lizzie organizes the presents the village chief sent in the morning, surprised with the sudden generosity of the village leader. Ju-hwan wonders if recovering the old belongings could leave her so happy like that, since she didn't even mind much when the wound vanished. Upon looking at Lizzie, he recalls that true happiness always hides in the simplest things of day to day. He smiles glad and approaches her, thinking it is precisely because of that he loves her so much and is proud to have her as a wife. Ju-hwan alerts he is leaving to hunt, leaving Lizzie a bit surprised with his sudden departure right in the morning. The two exchange affection and silly laughs while he says goodbye happily, guaranteeing that soon he will be back. Lizzie waves back at the door and asks affectionately for her beloved husband to take good care of himself during the hunt in the forest. Walking down the dirt trail, Ju-hwan remembers that old Gus had commented he would go out today to hunt some rabbits. The hunter passes by the firewood pile and stays thinking if they truly will have luck on today's hunt. He hopes to get at least one rabbit for Dorothy's Joy, who is always begging and dancing for a piece of meat. However, holding his hunting axe, the young man swallows hard upon wondering if he would have courage to kill such a cute little animal. Shaking his head, he tries to dismiss his modern sensitivities, knowing he needs to act like a true hunter. However, he can't avoid that the image of a cute and round little rabbit appears drawn in his thoughts. He blushes from embarrassment upon realizing the little animal makes him remember the cuteness of his own wife, making everything very difficult. Sighing, Juhuan hopes internally that if they find some animal, that it is at least ugly and scary. In the middle of the dark leaves of the forest, a dark creature with glowing red eyes observes everything in a threatening way. Sometime later, the young hunter returns to the front of his residence and lets out a sigh of fatigue after the chores. He notes that he already fetched water and chopped all the firewood of the day, but perceives he still has a good free time off left. The young man decides to take advantage of that moment of tranquility to practice a bit more magic and test his limits. He perceives that healing injuries became very easy, but complains for not managing to generate even a small spark of fire. Juhuan gets thoughtful and tries to understand the motive for his firepower having worked perfectly in that past situation. He questions himself, quite intrigued, if the magic only manifested that time for dealing with an extreme case of emergency decided. The youth closes his eyes and concentrates deeply on making the energy circulate through the center of his own body. He extends his arm with firmness and shouts by the name of his fire spell, hoping something incredible happens from his hand. Nothing happens, but he doesn't get shaken and just regrets, because little Dorothy would love to see a bit of magical pyrotechnics. The hunter knows his healing magic doesn't make cool and bright sound effects. That's why the little girl doesn't care much for it. He regrets silently for not having managed to show a bit of flames to impress and cheer up his little daughter. Suddenly, sparks of heat begin to rise on the tip of his fingers, leaving him completely shocked and jaw-dropped. A small flame lights up on his index finger, but he plays saying that looks more like the fire of a common lighter. In this moment, Dorothy comes out yawning from the cabin and rubs her eyes with sleep, calling her new father's attention in the yard. She tries to clear her blurred vision to see what Juhuan is doing that is so interesting out there under the daylight. The little girl widens her golden eyes in absolute amazement upon focusing her attention on the raised hand of the gigantic hunter. She points marveled to his finger and shouts enthusiastic that her father's hand is producing fire for real. Juhuan alerts for her not to get too close so as not to get burned, but the girl already wants to run to tell the news to her mother. Dorothy stays totally dazzled upon seeing the small flame dancing in the air right before her innocent and joyful little face. Hearing her daughter's celebration shouts, Lizzie comes out running from the cabin and approaches quickly the two in the garden. The young bride brings her hand to her mouth from so much surprise upon seeing, in fact, the fire that emanates from her gigantic husband's hand. While the two love the scene, Juhuan tries to increase the flame to leave them even happier, but perceives it is very difficult. Juhuan celebrates for being able to use both types of magic, but Lizzie lets out a surprised shout upon recalling an urgent task. The hunter gets confused upon seeing her leave, running hurriedly from there with Dorothy, without giving time for him to finish the demonstration. The young woman enters in a rush the cabin to check the pots, being followed closely by the small and curious Dorothy. Abandoned alone in the middle of the lawn, the prota regrets well-humored because he pushed himself quite a bit to light that flame. He looks at the lit little flame on his finger and perceives, with a drop of sweat on his forehead, that now he doesn't know how to turn it off. Without knowing what to do, he simply gives up and decides to continue with his finger lit until the fire decides to go out on its own. Suddenly, a crackling noise echoes, and the flame on his finger dissolves into small golden sparks, startling the young man. Walking through the forest, he concludes the magic of this world is bizarre and that he still hasn't managed to understand how it works. The young hunter opens the wooden door and enters again into the security and the cozy warmth of his beloved cabin. He spots little Dorothy standing next to the massive wooden bucket and decides to call her in a gentle way to see what's wrong. The sigh. Little girl turns around with a sad pout and complains, discouraged, that the amount of meat in the bucket decreased quite a bit. Lizzie gives a little laugh in the background, while Juhuan perceives that the only sadness of Dorothy is seeing her beloved meat stock dwindle. Moved by her pout, the hunter makes a firm expression and promises mentally he will bring fresh rabbit meat today. Suddenly, old Gus appears at the door and asks if Juhuan is already ready to go, giving a light start to the young man. Juhuan perceives his hunt master already arrived and greets him in a friendly way to give start to the works. He grabs his hunting belongings quickly with firmness and alerts the two that he is already departing on a trip. Dorothy runs to say goodbye and wishes a safe travels to her daddy, who thanks smiling for her affection. He fondles his daughter's little head in an affectionate way and praises her. Making the little one agree happily with blushed cheeks, Lizzie asks affectionately for him to take care in the woods, and Juhuan returns saying she also must take care at home. The hunter gives a sweet goodbye kiss to his wife, leaving little Dorothy totally surprised with that scene. With jealousy and making a very cute pout with her lips, the little girl asks to get a goodbye kiss too. Laughing at the situation, Juhuan lowers himself with affection to give a kiss to his daughter, while Lizzie observes everything, finding it funny. He gives a loud kiss on Dorothy's cheek, who opens a massive and radiant smile of extreme happiness on her face. Juhuan feels a smell of meat on her breath and asks if she went around eating hidden, and the little girl confesses, smiling. Leaving the cabin, the two hunters walk directly in the direction of where the experienced Gus had set his traps. Along the path, the elderly man continues to give several valuable lessons, pointing to the trees and teaching which ones serve for firewood. In some moments, he makes Juhuan stop to examine the rabbit droppings on the floor and identify the proximity of the prey. Suddenly, the old master extends his hand and orders in a low voice for Juhuan to stop immediately where he is. With quite a bit of caution, the elderly man points with his finger in the direction of a nearby bush, indicating where the target is located. The youth widens his eyes in total surprise and focuses his attention to see what type of creature is hidden there. He comes across a massive and muscular beast with long ears, perceiving that doesn't look like a common rabbit. He thinks the creature resembles more an evolved and bizarre kangaroo than the cute animals he knew back on Earth. Upon perceiving their presence, the beast growls with aggressiveness and exhibits its sharp teeth. Without showing any fear, the master comments that the creature still has a lot of energy for having been caught a short time ago. Being perfect for the first hunt, Gus alerts that it won't be easy at all, because taking down a beast that fights back the attacks demands a lot of courage and coldness from the hunter. He explains that facing a wild animal that fights back leaves an unforgettable mark on the mind of whoever hunts for the first time. The elderly man orders Juhuan to pull the special arrow he received from him, and the young hunter agrees, serious with his head, to prepare himself. The master praises Juhuan's intelligence for already managing to comprehend the local language in so short time since he arrived there. With a look of encouragement, Gus delivers the responsibility to the young man and alerts in a solemn way that initial hunt belongs to him. The experienced hunter promises to teach him about the true cruelty of hunting and guarantees he will never forget that day. The veteran orders in a low voice for him to take a few more steps and get closer to the monster with quite a bit of care and attention. Gus sends him to aim at the leg first, and Juhuan gets surprised upon understanding that serves as training with a live target in motion. He positions himself to shoot, knowing that first he must hit. The creature stopped and later aim while it thrashes in pain. The old man teaches that the forest is fair and doesn't favor men, alerting that acting with silly cruelty one day will bring serious consequences. The elderly man alerts that to survive and return alive home, he must never forget today's lesson. While pulling the bowstring, Juhuan hesitates for an instant when aiming at the leg, knowing that shot won't kill the animal, only cause an unnecessary pain. He continues with the aim locked on the target and complains mentally for not comprehending the necessity of that so severe training method. Impatient with the delay, Gus orders with firmness for him to shoot soon at the beast's leg, and next, aim direct at its head. The wild monster exhibits a dreadful expression and begins to drool with hatred, growling in the direction of the two hunters in the middle of the woods. Upon looking at the trapped beast, the young man recalls suddenly the desperation he felt when he woke up for the first time in this world. Painful images of his former body, extremely thin and weak, locked in a metal cage, begin to invade his mind. He recalls with dread the bodies rotting in the open and that filthy space where humans lost all their dignity and life. Although he doesn't understand about hunting or survival in the forest, Juhuan comprehends that there exists a single unmutable truth in that moment. He knows perfectly that his experienced master is just trying to train him with seriousness to make him live as a hunter, without hesitating any more second. Juhuan releases the heavy string of the hunting bow and fires his fast attack in the direction of the target. The fast arrow cuts the air with strength and surgical precision, flying directly in the direction of the monster that is stuck in the trap. The projectile pierces the wild beast's leg in a brutal way, making it let out a sharp and deafening squeal of pure pain. He gets a bit stunned with his own precision and murmurs, surprised to himself that he truly managed to hit the shot on the target. The old hunter orders coldly for him to shoot again, and the young man asks, incredulous, if he really must fire one more arrow. The veteran sends him to aim at the front legs now, and Juhuan concludes the elderly man must consider that painful process necessary. Dismissing any pity he could feel for the beast, he focuses on his aim, thinking of the security and the well-being of his beloved family. A new squeal of pain echoes loud through the forest along with a splash of blood, indicating that one more precise shot hit the monster. He prepares the next shot and tries to ignore the prey's cries of pain, repeating mentally that those are just normal animal noises. Juhuan fires one more arrow with determination, thinking only about protecting and giving a dignified livelihood to his bride and daughter. The certain shot hits directly the monster's shining eye, which doesn't manage to sketch any fast defense reaction. Ju-won reflects that he doesn't care about transforming himself into a demon or into an assassin. As long as he guarantees their security, he knows he could have killed the beast immediately, but needed to prolong its suffering for ends of his hunting learning. The hunter recognizes the cruelty of that act against nature, but understands perfectly that hunting is a cold fight for survival. Knowing that everything boils down to surviving, he promises to himself that he will never forget the harsh and pitiless lesson he had today. Gus sends the young man to gather all the rabbits they hunted before to take them home, surprising Ju-won with the order. The veteran agrees, smiling, and the young hunter makes a respectful bow and thanks from the bottom of his heart for the generosity. Next, the elderly man leans on his wooden staff and invites him to go capture the last rabbit that remained in the woods. Ju-won deflects discreetly his look and focuses his attention on the heavy bag he is holding with his own hands. Upon peeking inside the cloth bag, he comes across a cute little rabbit of brown fur that remains alive and very scared there. Ju-won points out that that animal is quite different from the others, and Gus sends him to run quickly to capture it for good. However, the young man holds his master's arm with care and asks for him to wait a second before acting. He suggests that instead of killing it, they could raise the rabbit in the cabin to serve as emergency food in the future. The prota gestures with his hands and confesses to Gus that he wishes only to take the little animal alive. Refusing to take it down, now Gus lets out an amused little laugh in front of that so naive and sentimental attitude from his gigantic hunting disciple. The veteran agrees in a friendly way with his head and says they will do exactly what the young man suggested. He delivers the bag to the young hunter and tells him to grab the animal alive at once, hearing an animated thank you from him with the heavy bag in his hands. Ju-won walks back satisfied by his master's side through the low vegetation. He walks with quite a bit of care so as not to hurt the small and fragile little animal that is stored inside the cloth sack. The furry and plump little rabbit keeps curled up and very quiet in its corner, totally oblivious to the happy destiny that awaits it. The next morning, the sun rays illuminate their peaceful and isolated cabin, bringing an atmosphere of quite a bit of tranquility. Ju-won reflects that in his old life, he never had hope of building a family, and because of that didn't have ambitions in life. While he carves a piece of wood with a sharp knife, he thinks that doing that is a bit strange but very rewarding. The hunter smiles calm and reflects that for the first time in life, he has a real reason to work hard and protect who he loves. Suddenly, he focuses his attention on a small, shiny wooden box that is resting on top of the work table. He approaches and perceives with surprise that the plates inside the box possess letters of the local language carved on its surface. Quite enthusiastic, he takes one of the plates in his hand and thinks that material can help him learn for good the new language. He runs up to Gus, gesturing and asking in his incomplete language for the master to teach him to read the letters on those tablets. Gus asks, surprised if the young man really wants to learn to read, and Ju-won answers with firmness and determination that he desires that a lot. Scratching his head in a thoughtful way, the elderly man lets out a sigh and agrees to help his young apprentice in that important task. The veteran walks with slow steps in the direction of one of the wooden boxes piled in the corner of the room to grab something useful. Searching the chest of old belongings, the master comments that the young man certainly will need some special writing items. Gus delivers the study materials into Ju-won's hands, who gets immensely grateful and begs politely for him to begin teaching. The elderly man sends the young man to follow him to the study table, and Ju-won agrees happily with his head, anxious for the start of the class. Wielding a beautiful black quill, the young hunter begins to practice the writing of the characters over a sheet of yellowish paper. Gus observes him in silence and thinks his apprentice is a mysterious man, questioning himself what the utility of reading would be for him. The elderly man reflects that he never imagined he still would use those materials he bought in the past when he dreamed of being hired by a noble. He remembers he spent a lot of time and effort to learn to read and writes that if he knew his destiny, he wouldn't have bothered so much. Shaking his head, the elderly man dismisses the bitter memories and convinces himself his military past must stay forgotten for good. Gus focuses his look on the window and decides he needs to explore the heart of the forest in search of goblins, knowing the creatures live in the woods. The elderly man explains that with the arrival of spring in the mountains, the movement and the dangerousness of the goblin hordes increase quite a bit. The master recognizes that despite inexperienced, Ju-won learns very fast and would be of massive help for any group of adventurers. Feeling a strong sting in his limping leg, Gus concludes the physical pain is a clear warning that the reunion with the monsters is close. Taken by a deep and vengeful hatred, the old hunter swears to himself that he will kill down to the last goblin he finds in his path. Outside of the elderly man's dark thoughts, the peaceful wooden cabin shines beautifully under the warm rays of the afternoon sun. In the living room, Lizzie cuts the pink fabric with a pair of scissors and guarantees to little Dorothy she is tailoring a beautiful new outfit for her. The mother gives a gentle laugh and asks if she knows how many times she already asked this same question, making the little girl shrug awkwardly. Suddenly, Lizzie hears a rustic squeaking sound coming from the front door and turns around curious, calling by her groom's name. Juwan opens the door and enters smiling, being immediately received with a loving embrace from Dorothy, who runs shouting for him. Dorothy exhibits all proud her new dress to her father, who gets enchanted with the cuteness of his little daughter in new clothes with the girl still in his arms. Juwan places the bag on the floor and perceives it is thrashing on its own in a strange way. Lizzie lets out a surprised shout upon noticing that the large cloth bag really is moving from one side to the other. Little Dorothy asks excited if that is some type of magic trick, but Juwan answers smiling that it isn't. The hunter promises to show what it has inside, untying the knot with just one of his hands. While he continues holding Dorothy with ease, Lizzie approaches quickly with affection and offers to help him open and empty the cloth bag once and for all. Suddenly, the two long ears of a small little animal jump out of the opening, startling the two girls. Dorothy widens her golden eyes and shouts in an enthusiastic way that the small animal really moved before them. The girl gives a shout of happiness upon seeing that it deals with a beautiful little rabbit. Wanting to go running to touch it at once, Lizzie asks out loud for her daughter to wait, alerting she herself is going to withdraw the little animal from there to avoid any danger. With a lot of delicacy, the hunter's large hands wrap the little animal's body and withdraw it softly from inside the bag. Upon seeing the little rabbit come out completely, Lizzie takes a massive start of surprise and ends up falling sitting on the wooden floor of the house. Dorothy observes the small animal with wide open and shining eyes, totally hypnotized by its cute appearance. The little girl exclaims full of surprise and curiosity that rabbit is very different and strange from the ones she knew. She points marveled to the small detail there is on the little animal's head, calling everyone's attention to that. The horned little rabbit supports itself on its two back legs and looks around, leaving Dorothy even more excited with the novelty. While the little one finds the animal a darling, Lizzie yells worried and sends her daughter not to get too close to the creature. The mother alerts with fear that the presence of a horn on the rabbit's head can indicate it is dangerous and aggressive. She asks for the little girl to wait and approaches slowly with her hands extended, determined to capture the animal for her security. Nervous and shaking a bit, the young woman makes a fast movement and throws her hands in the direction of the little rabbit to try to hold it. To her surprise, she manages to hold the little animal in her arms without any difficulty and without it trying to attack her. Although she is happy, Lizzie gets intrigued and thinks it shouldn't have been so simple like that to grab a wild animal in the cabin. She brings the little animal close to her own face to examine it better and perceives there is something wrong happening with its body. The young woman notices with sadness that the little rabbit is shaking and that one of its small little paws is injured and bleeding lightly. Upon seeing the little animal's suffering, little Dorothy gets with her eyes misty and regrets a lot for the pain it is feeling. She looks imploring to Juwan and alerts that the animal is injured, making the hunter repeat the word with quite a bit of worry. The young man approaches in a gentle way his bride and asks calmly for her to pass the small injured animal to his hands. Lizzie delivers with care the trembling little rabbit into Juwan's hands, hoping her strong husband manages to do something to help it. Holding the fragile little animal with extreme delicacy, the prota focuses his thought on performing the healing spell. A bright and magical light emanates from the palms of Juwan's hands. Wrapping completely the body of the injured little rabbit, Dorothy celebrates enthusiastic upon seeing that the injury on the little paw vanished completely and that the little rabbit doesn't feel any more pain. With blushed cheeks and jumping from joy, the little girl praises her father and says he is the most incredible man in the whole world. Juwan coughs, disguising his pride with a silly smile, while his little daughter runs to embrace and hang on his muscular leg. He lowers himself to place the rabbit on the floor, but the girl shouts asking for him to wait before freeing the small animal. Juwan gets confused upon seeing his little daughter running hurriedly up to him carrying an empty straw basket and asking for him to place the animal there. Answering her request, the hunter places the rabbit with a lot of care inside the wooden basket to make the little one's will. The small horned rabbit lies down comfortably and falls asleep in there, making Dorothy whisper marveled. Juwan points to her in a friendly way, but the girl gets confused and asks what his words mean. Lizzie smiles and translates saying the father wants Dorothy herself to take care of the little rabbit, leaving the little girl totally surprised. With a massive cute smile on her face, she guarantees she is going to take very good care of the small little animal and protect it always. The three unite on the floor around the basket, and Dorothy caresses the animal's little head, promising to give it all affection and care. Lizzie and Ju-won exchange looks packed with complicity and give beautiful smiles, happy with the so sweet moment they are living with the passing of the hours. The cold and starry night falls slowly over their peaceful wooden cabin in the isolated forest. In the bedroom, little Dorothy sleeps peacefully underneath the warm blankets with the rabbit's basket resting next to her pillow. Ju-won reflects thoughtful with his wife that humans are very greedy, and even when they win enough, never stop wanting more. He remembers when they escaped that captive wagon and got the cabin, deciding to expand it so Dorothy had space to play. He confesses that now that he possesses a real home and a beautiful family, he feels the strong desire to learn to read and to write to protect them. A tender smile rises on the hunter's face upon looking at Lizzie, concluding that she is the greatest and most precious present he has ever received in life. She trains the reading of the tablets, pronouncing the words slowly, and the hunter thinks with affection that she deserves a rest after working so much. With all the affection of the world, he embraces her from behind by the shoulders in an affectionate way to give her the comfort and the love she deserves. Lizzie takes a small start when Ju-won embraces her from behind, but soon calms down and thanks for his affection. Feeling his touch on her shoulders, she comments quietly that her husband's hands are very warm. Ju-won just squeezes her arms in a very soft way, showing all his affection in that moment of silence. After that, his hands slide with care downward, transmitting a sensation of total security to her. Ju-won pulls her for an even tighter and welcoming embrace, leaving Lizzie quite embarrassed and with her cheeks red. The two continue embraced very close to the soft light of a lit lantern. Enjoying that instant of peace together, time passes, and the candle flame inside the lantern finally goes out completely in the darkness of the bedroom. The next day, carriages travel down the road, because it takes a day and a half of travel to arrive at the big city where the information broker stays. Inside one of them, the village chief complains they barely traveled half a day, and his body is already stiff. Besides thinking about the expenses with the ticket and the informant, even complaining about the discomfort, he reflects that all that effort is going to be worth it, since most healing mages usually are weak physically. The elderly man remembers that Mountain Resident is quite different from them, because he never saw someone so massive and strong in his entire life. With a greedy smile on his face, he calculates that valuable information must yield easily more than 10 gold coins. In this, the man next to him asks if they should try to summon a hero too, and the other answers that the kingdom already tried to do that several times. The other comments about rumors that the temple believes a hero has already been summoned, while the first questions if the enemy nation's hero is fake. He keeps questioning how they can trust heroes from centuries ago, and says that if the enemy's hero is a farce, soon it will be discovered. Listening to the conversation, the village chief perceives he had forgotten that that region where they live stays right close to the enemy territory. He concludes they need to sell the information and leave there as fast as possible, because the enemy can initiate an invasion at any moment. Back at the cabin, little Dorothy tries to wake her horned little rabbit, saying she is going to play with it to chase away its boredom. Lizzie enters the room and alerts her daughter that the small pet animal is not food, leaving the little girl confused with the comment Dorothy tells her mother not to be silly, because she knows very well that baby rabbits don't serve as food. Lizzie plays, asking for the girl to stop drooling on top of him, making the daughter realize and run to fetch food for the rabbit. The little girl leaves, running very joyful from the cabin to go feed the animal, leaving Lizzie surprised with so much agitation. Upon leaving, she sees a new fence and finds it strange, wondering why her father is building that if they already have a house. But right in sequence, the little girl remembers the real motive for having left the inside of the house. She recalls smiling that she went out there precisely to feed the rabbits that stay in the wooden pen. Upon looking at the animals up close, Dorothy pouts and comments in a funny way that they continue large and ugly. She holds a handful of very green leaves in her hands and alerts the little animals that the time to eat has arrived. The little girl explains to the rabbits she is very busy today and asks for them to behave and eat alone in a polite way. When she places the food in the feeder, the food mysteriously multiplies, and she gets startled upon seeing that now there are much more leaves, super excited with the discovery. She imagines she maybe also knows how to use magic and decides to show that to her father as soon as he returns. She begins to daydream she will be able to use her magic on the wolf meat and makes a triumphant pose at the top of a mountain of food. Finding all that extremely amusing, the girl celebrates happily near the rabbit's pen. Meanwhile, Lizzie holds the wolf pelt and thinks the merchant's wagon must arrive soon, being a problem if she can't buy what they need. She knows merchants love to buy wolf pelts, but hesitates because that animal was Ju-hwan's first hunt, and she doesn't want to sell it. Lizzie stays divided because there are many necessary items to buy, like new clothes and decent shoes for her husband. She embraces the wolf pelt in a dramatic way, while regrets needing water containers, kitchen pots, and more food supplies. She looks at the rabbit pelt stretched on the floor with scissors and comb to the side, perceiving that only one of those small pelts won't suffice. Lizzie makes a thoughtful and determined expression, facing the situation while trying to find a solution to get money. She decides to tie her long and beautiful brown hair in a high ponytail to prepare herself for what she intends to do next. With all the determination of the world, the young peasant woman stretches her arm and holds firmly the metal scissors that were on the floor. Shortly after, Juwon's voice echoes from outside the cabin, alerting Lizzie that little Dorothy is already there in the yard. The little girl runs very animated to embrace her father and shouts for him. Receiving an affectionate greeting back from the hunter, Lizzie approaches him with a gentle smile and asks if he is already back from his chores in the forest. Juwon stays paralyzed, looking fixedly at his wife, while little Dorothy perceives her father's shock upon looking at her mother. Lizzie appears with her hair cut very short, and Dorothy points surprised, shouting that all her mother's long hair simply vanished. "That is tough. I preferred her with long hair, but she is still gorgeous." Juwon murmurs his wife's name in total shock, without managing to believe in what she just did with her own look. Desperate, in a direct way he asks where all her hair went, while Lizzie gives a little laugh awkwardly, realizing that maybe she made a mistake. Dorothy pouts with her arms crossed and complains upset, saying her mother's long and shiny hair was very beautiful. Juwon regrets deeply in thought, finding a tremendous injustice. Her hair having had such a sad destiny, he takes a few steps forward in her direction in the living room, calling her name with a quite worried and serious tone of voice. Juwon touches softly on Lizzie's cheek and short hair and asks for apologies for making her go through this situation. Upon seeing her husband's reaction full of regret and affection, Lizzie thinks to herself that he truly is a very unusual person. She recalls that most women let their hair grow just to sell it and manage to survive, finding his attitude very different. However, her husband's tone of voice is so gentle and welcoming that suddenly it gives her a massive urge to cry from emotion. Lizzie embraces him very tight by the neck, feeling that that urge to cry is not of sadness, but rather of pure happiness. I absolutely love this couple. If you want a sweet wife like this, smash that like button and leave a comment. She feels immensely grateful, and with her heart warmed, while little Dorothy observes the two of them with a joyful smile on her face. On the path, Dorothy invites her mother to climb also onto the little seat Juwon carries on his back, but she answers it would get too heavy for him. Juwon just gives a peaceful smile, carrying his little daughter with ease while she waves animated from on top of the wooden structure. The little girl points anxious forward, asking to go soon, and the family follows the trip together and happy in the direction of the village. In a short time, they spot the mountains and the wooden constructions of the small town where local trade happens. Upon entering the place, they come across busy streets and several people walking and talking everywhere. Dorothy runs happily a bit ahead of her parents, commenting animated about the wonderful smell of food she feels in the air. Juwon looks around thoughtful and tries to remember when was the last time he walked through a street so full, thinking if it was on Christmas before reincarnating several residents and travelers pass by them in the stone-paved alleys, with the local trade movement very active at that hour of the day. The hunter keeps walking in silence by Lizzie's side, observing attentively the dynamics of the people who live in that region. He recalls briefly his old modern life back on Earth, confirming to himself that truly, it made a long time since he was in a crowd. Juwon remembers that at that time, he used to walk completely alone in the middle of all those unknown people in the cold city. But now, his wife walks right by his side, matching steps with his, and his little daughter gets radiant just for strolling in the street. With a light smile on his face, he finally comprehends what the wonderful sensation is of walking in a peaceful way, accompanied by his family. Very curious, the little girl leaves running ahead to look up close at the merchandise displayed in the merchant's fair stalls. She stops before a stand full of large clay pots and alerts happily her parents that she would like to give a look around there. The stall vendor announces out loud his products, inviting everyone who passes to buy and guaranteeing an excellent price. Dorothy lets out a sound of surprise and admiration upon seeing the novelties and interesting things that are being offered at the local fair. Suddenly, a little blonde boy of red garments and blue eyes appears right near the carriage, and the two stare at each other with quite a bit of curiosity. Dorothy points in his direction and makes a comment, leaving the little boy confused about what exactly that unknown girl wants to say. Lizzie comments, laughing, that his daughter looks a lot like him, making the hunter ponder if there truly exists some physical similarity with the little girl. Lizzie places the cut braid of her own brown hair over the merchant's counter, decided to sell it to get coins. The merchant of gray beard examines the situation with suspicion, while Juwon and Lizzie wait in silence for his evaluation. The vendor feigns disinterest and says there are so many pelts in the market lately that the value plummeted, leaving Lizzie a bit disappointed. In thought, the greedy man notices the fur is shiny and perfect, but decides not to show that to manage a smaller price. Lizzie gets discouraged upon deducing that with his excuse, she will only manage very cheap products, without knowing the merchant is acting in bad faith. The merchant keeps plotting in thought to devalue to the maximum the valuable things the young peasant woman brought to negotiate. Juhwan emanates an intimidating aura from behind his wife, scaring the vendor, who immediately changes tone and praises the incredible size of the pelt. That is it, Prota. Do not let him rip off our waifu. The climate gets quite tense at the stall, and the merchant swallows hard in front of the fixed and scary look of the giant hunter before him. Without hesitating, Juhwan stretches his arm quickly and grabs Lizzie's hair braid back, interrupting the unfair negotiation in that instant. Upon being confronted by the hunter, the merchant complains of pain and gets shocked with the tremendous physical strength the young man shows. Without the slightest effort, Juhwan calls his wife to go to another village and affirms he feels the lie in that man's eyes, leaving the cheater totally dumbfounded. Lizzie ponders, worried that the other village stays very far, but the hunter calms her, saying they will arrive there very fast. The merchant reflects, scared that that massive man is not just strong, but also was so firm that he didn't even manage to discuss or bargain. Juhwan explains calmly to his bride that the rabbit pelt is in great state and that the vendor was lying, leaving her surprised. The merchant tries to defend himself, saying it was the current market price, but Juhwan counters, saying he just wanted to buy everything for a pittance. Seeing he was going to lose the deal, the merchant yields and proposes to include salt, a pot, and even male clothes to close the exchange. Once and for all, Lizzie perceives the merchant's dishonesty and stares at him serious, questioning with firmness the motive of him acting in such a greedy way. She holds Juhwan's hand and calls him to leave from there to look for an honest place that pays a fair value. Leaving the vendor in panic, Juhwan suggests carrying his wife on his back because of the distance to the other shop, but she smiles and guarantees she manages to walk perfectly well. The vendor begins to despair upon seeing the excellent quality merchandise leave and tries to call their attention in any way. He stretches his arm, imploring desperately for them to wait, but the couple keeps walking, holding hands without giving the least attention. Without managing to reverse the situation, the merchant bites his teeth, upset and regrets alone for having lost that great profit opportunity. The two continue the stroll in a peaceful way, while the cheating merchant stays with his head down and totally depressed in his empty stall. Meanwhile, Dorothy points with a lot of pride to Juwon and boasts to the other children of the fair until her mother calls her to leave. While they walk back, Dorothy keeps running happily right behind her parents and repeating all proud that that is her father. Lying in a comfortable way, the girl thinks that her father's smell transmits a lot of security and that she always will be protected by her strong super dad. She wonders sleepily why it is so warm there, remembering she was dying of cold just a few moments ago. Suddenly, the little girl remembers she is well snuggled and secure inside the warm coat in Juwon's arms. She places her blonde little head out of the clothes and remembers immediately her small pet rabbit. Dorothy asks for her father to place her on the floor very fast because she needs to go running to feed her beloved little rabbit. Juwon lowers himself with care and places her on the floor, allowing the daughter to run freely in the direction of the cabin yard. The little girl runs, animated, shouting she already arrived and she is there to play with it, while her parents observe her happy. She quickly gathers a pile of very fresh green leaves from the floor with her small hands to give to her little animal. She goes running all happy in the direction of the wooden pen, alerting that finally the time for its meal arrived. However, Dorothy widens her golden eyes in total shock upon looking into the wooden pen. The pen is completely empty, and she perceives, scared, that the small horned rabbit is not in any place anymore. Extremely sad, the little girl lets the leaves fall to the floor and begins to cry loud from so much desperation. Hearing the crying, Lizzie runs worried to her daughter, asking what happened, while the girl regrets that the animal vanished. Lizzie gets surprised upon seeing the empty house, while Dorothy keeps crying and imploring for the little rabbit to return. Hearing the shouting from the outside, Juhwan comes out running from the cabin, quite worried to understand what is happening. Lizzie explains the rabbit escaped, and the hunter gets surprised upon realizing this was the motive for so much crying from his daughter. He finds it strange and asks why Lizzie is also crying together, and she confesses, sobbing. She got very sad with the animal's disappearance. Juhwan gets with an unbelievable expression on his face, without understanding how the two managed to cry so much because of a rabbit escape. The hunter can't hold himself back and begins to give roars of laughter at the situation, leaving the two tearful ones even more nonplussed with him. Dorothy begins to give light punches on his leg, complaining she hates him, but Juhwan finds the scene too cute and thinks how she will take care of other animals. He reflects happily that he is very happy for being able to give such sincere and relaxed laughs by the side of the people he loves. Far from there, in the middle of the dark forest, the old mentor of Greenhood observes from afar behind a massive rock and whispers relieved. The old hunter's countenance is of pure determination, although he carries a tired and worried expression with what he discovered. The hunter finally managed to locate the secret hiding place of the goblins, who hide in the depths of the forest darkness. A scary goblin of glowing red eyes and sharp teeth lets out a sinister growl without perceiving the presence of the elderly man spying. The elderly man feels a massive urge to advance and defeat them right now, but knows acting on impulse alone would be a useless death. He knows the place is packed with monsters, and that if food or resources lack soon, the goblins are going to begin to fight among themselves. Gus reflects that if a single goblin loses control and decides to attack the neighboring village, the entire horde will go out of control immediately. He knows these isolated creatures don't represent so much danger and are considered pretty weak if compared to other magical monsters. The true danger is they always attack in a pack and multiply as fast as rabbits. Recovering the number of losses easily, the elderly man remembers with regret that the creatures costumed to abduct women from all regions to force them to increase the monster horde. The destiny of those captives used to be tragic and of much suffering in the dark caves, resulting in a terrible cruelty. He concludes that with the arrival of spring, the monster's desire is going to increase, being necessary to eliminate the entire pack before that happens, and to manage to perform that difficult combat mission, he knows he will need to count on the help of that giant hunter. Seeing the young man's sincere gratitude every time he teaches him makes the elderly man's conscience weigh a bit for wanting to involve him in a dangerous combat. However, he moves away in the forest, thinking there is no other choice, and that Juhwan is the only one capable of defeating those terrible creatures. The next morning, Lizzie wakes up sleepily and gives a lazy yawn while she gets ready to start the domestic chores of the day. She looks in the direction of the entrance and calls by her husband upon spotting his silhouette returning from one more of his morning walks through the woods. Curious to know what he brought, she walks with calm steps out of the wooden cabin in the direction of the external storage. Upon opening the door, she gets surprised upon seeing two massive rabbits hanging by their feet and comments astonished about their giant size. She asks if he managed to hunt rabbits today again, while Juhwan holds a small hatchet and begins to explain how his hunt went. The hunter recalls the moment he spotted one of the fast preys leaping through the verdant grass and stretched his arm to try to grab it. However, he ended up losing balance and falling face first on the dirt floor, while the agile wild animal gave a spectacular leap to escape. The rabbit landed softly on the grass a bit further ahead, turning around to look back as if it were mocking his fall. Very irritated, the youth got up wiping the dust and thought he intended to capture the animal alive, but that now he wouldn't have any more patience. With a look of extreme fury and clenched teeth, he guaranteed to himself he would capture that cheeky creature in any way. He began to run at high speed through the forest behind the animal, initiating a frantic chase through the trees and bushes. Back to the present, he disguises the fall, saying it was a fast hunt, making Lizzie clap her hands and praise him quite a bit for the skill. With a beautiful smile of admiration, she asks with enthusiasm to her husband if they should roast the delicious meat or prepare it with salt. Juhwan suggests salting the meat, but Lizzie decides to roast it, leaving the hunter confused about which cooking method they are going to use. She concludes happily she will do a roast with salt, understanding everything in her own way. While the husband stays with a drop on his head awkwardly, Lizzie promises to prepare a delicious meal for the family, and Juhwan says he can barely wait to taste it, leaving the wife even more animated. While he roasts the meat on the campfire, he thinks the soft aroma of the bamboo is going to penetrate the food, leaving the accompanying vegetables much more flavorful. Suddenly, he perceives with certain worry that the campfire flame began to decrease and to go out again in an unexpected way. Juhwan sighs lightly and generates a small flame of fire right on the tip of his index finger to reignite the firewood that was going out. He observes the small flame and reflects thoughtful that that is a pretty simple power, looking useful in some moments but not so much in others. The hunter knows he needs to leave the meat golden and appetizing before Lizzie and Dorothy get very hungry, waiting for the meal. He directs his index finger with the magical flame in the direction of the campfire to try to increase the fire intensity in a controlled way. To his desperation, a massive explosion of fire rises suddenly, wrapping all the meat in gigantic flames and scaring the youth. Juhwan shouts, asking for the fire to stop immediately, remembering desperate that that meal is for his family and that the meat cannot burn. He wonders confused why the power worked so intensely now, deducing that this magic maybe doesn't manifest by his own direct control. Juhwan remembers that the fire used against the wolf in their first encounter can have been conjured directly on the target and not generated from himself. He reflects that if the magic rises directly on the target, that explains why his body never burns. Deciding to place that theory into practice now, the hunter crouches and focuses his thought, imagining the heat wrapping softly the rabbit meat to cook it in a tender and perfect way. He keeps his eyes closed and concentrates quite a bit for the food to stay perfectly golden and flavorful without burning. Upon opening his eyes, he sees that the fire wrapped the food exactly the way he wanted and celebrates animated upon perceiving his plan worked. Observing the excellent result, the hunter smiles relieved for finally having comprehended the secret of how his fire magic manifests. He gets very proud and content for having managed to prepare a meat roast, so perfect using only his new magical control. Dorothy shouts, marveled with the dish on the table, while Lizzie praises the wonderful aroma, and Juwon thinks that looks a lot like roasted chicken. Lizzie gets surprised with the appearance of the dish, while little Dorothy beats the cutlery on the table, shouting, animated for red meat. Juwon holds the succulent roast with both hands and divides it in half with quite a bit of ease, releasing a warm and very smelly steam. He delivers the well-served portions of roasted meat to his wife and to his little daughter, inviting the two in an affectionate way to try it. Without losing time, Lizzie and little Dorothy give massive bites into the succulent meat and chew, happy with the wonderful flavor of the dish. Lizzie approves the flavor with a big smile, and the little girl gets with her eyes shining from so much joy, finding the meal the best in the world. Seeing the happiness of the two, Juwon smiles and thinks that finally he understands what it means to feel satisfied just observing his family eat. The three continue dining joyful in the cabin, and Juwon reflects that using the fire element became extremely simple after getting the correct knack. Later, he trains his ability outdoors and discovers he manages to launch and control flames on targets at about half a meter of distance. Upon seeing the rock in flames, the hunter ponders if this power will work on living beings and perceives how much that ability can be scary. He observes his own hands with firmness, concluding that with the healing magic and the fire magic, he will be able to protect Lizzie and Dorothy from any danger. The hunter wonders if this gift was granted by that strange Santa from Earth so he could live happy and protect who he loves. He reflects that when Christmas arrives, maybe he must prepare a special tribute table as a way of thank you for this great present. Suddenly, Dorothy's animated voice echoes from inside the house, alerting that the little rabbit finally woke up, making the hunter look back. The little girl runs, animated, holding the basket with the animal inside, alerting in a cute way she is going to introduce all the rooms of the home to it. She points to the stone stove and explains to the small horned animal that that is the kitchen, the place where all meals are made. She approaches her little face to the animal and does a caress on it, reinforcing in a tone of secret that the little rabbit now is a very important pet animal for her. Dorothy points in the direction of a simple wooden wall and presents to the little rabbit, which tilts its little head confused without understanding anything. In sequence, she alerts the little animal she is going to introduce it to an extremely important person of the house while she walks in the direction of Lizzie. She places the little rabbit very close to Lizzie's face and alerts that that is her mother and that the small animal must never forget that. In this moment, Juhwan opens the cabin door and enters the room, being spotted by his daughter who shouts happily calling by her father. Dorothy runs up to Juhwan and raises the basket, asking for the rabbit to greet the hunter and introduce the father to the small horned animal. The little girl alerts her father in a proud way that the little rabbit is her hunter, leaving Juhwan totally confused with that declaration. He asks what she wants to say with that, while Lizzie observes the conversation in the background in an apprehensive way and lets out a worried sigh. Lizzie stays in silence for a moment with blushed cheeks, showing certain shyness and hesitation before speaking about the subject. Upon hearing the word hunter, Juhwan approaches quickly his wife and stays in total shock with a suspicion that just arose in his mind. He looks at her in a quite surprised way and thinks if truly it would be possible that in that body so weak and small, there existed a novelty taken by a massive emotion and respect. The hunter kneels slowly on the wooden floor before his bride with his eyes wide open. He touches with care on Lizzie's belly, imagining emotional that there is a baby on the way, while she stays surprised with his reaction. Wow, this story just keeps getting better. Drop a comment below showing what kind of waifu you would want as a wife to see if you actually made it to the very end.